Welcome to the forgotten chronicles of the One Piece world, where ancient mysteries drift through time like whispers on an endless sea. Tonight, we journey beyond recorded history, into epochs so distant that even the scholars of Ohara could only glimpse their shadows. This is the story of the Age of Heaven, a time when gods walked among mortals, when the very geography of our world was shaped by divine hands, and when powers beyond imagination governed the seas. Let the gentle rhythm of forgotten legends carry you into peaceful slumber as we explore the deepest mysteries that time has nearly erased. In the beginning, before time itself learned to mark its passage, with the precision of ticking clocks and turning calendar pages, the world existed in a state of divine harmony that modern minds can barely comprehend. The Age of Heaven stretched across millennia like a vast tapestry woven from starlight and dreams, an epoch so ancient that even the stones themselves have forgotten the weight of the footsteps that once graced their surfaces. This was a time when the very concept of separation between mortal and divine remained as foreign as the idea of an ocean without waves. The transition from this golden age to the era we now inhabit was not marked by the sudden crash of thunder or the violent upheaval of earthquakes, but rather by a gradual fading, like the way twilight slowly surrenders to night. The Tenreki, the sky calendar that once measured the passage of divine seasons, gave way to the Kaireki, the sea circle calendar that governs our current understanding of temporal progression. This shift was not merely administrative, but represented something far more profound, the moment when humanity inherited a world that had been shaped by beings whose very nature transcended the limitations that define our daily existence. Nico Robin, that scholar of lost things and keeper of forbidden knowledge, once stood before the poneglyph in Alabaster's tomb and spoke words that carried the weight of forgotten centuries. Though she wove truth and deception together like threads in a complex pattern, her knowledge of Alabaster's ancient history during the Age of Heaven reveals the staggering depth of civilization that existed before recorded time began its methodical march. She spoke of Kahara's conquest in the year 239 of Heaven, of the completion of the Great Taf Temple in Alubana in year 306, of a hero named Mudin, who walked the earth in year 325. Whether these specific details emerge from genuine historical knowledge or from the fertile imagination of someone desperate to protect a greater secret, they paint a picture of a world where human civilization flourished under the watchful eyes of beings whose power dwarfed anything we might recognize today. The very fact that Robin could conjure such specificity, such intricate detail about events that occurred over a millennium before the sea circle calendar even began, suggests that somewhere in the vast libraries of her mind, fragments of that ancient age continue to survive like pressed flowers between the pages of a book thought lost forever. The evidence for this forgotten epoch extends far beyond the uncertain testimony of improvised histories. The geography itself bears witness to divine intervention on a scale that transforms entire continents into monuments. The Red Line, that massive wall of stone and earth that circumnavigates the globe like a scar across the planet's face, was once known by a name that carries profound implications for our understanding of who shaped this world and why. Whitebeard himself, that titan among men whose very presence could shake islands from their foundations, once referred to this geographical marvel as Kaminokuni, the land of gods. This designation was not metaphorical poetry, but literal description, acknowledgement that the highest peaks of the Red Line once served as the dwelling place of beings whose nature transcended mortal understanding. Here, in palaces built from clouds and starlight, the pantheon of the Age of Heaven maintained their celestial court. The sun god Nika held dominion over light and liberation, while forest gods tended to groves that spanned continents. Rain gods commanded storms that could reshape coastlines, and earth gods moved mountains as easily as a child might rearrange pebbles on a beach. The mythology that underpins this understanding draws heavily from sources that predate even the ancient texts of our world, echoing creation stories that suggest universal patterns in how divine beings relate to the mortal realm. In Shinto tradition, the cosmos began as a cosmic egg, containing all matter and energy, which gradually separated into distinct planes of existence. The lightest, purest elements rose to form Takamagahara, the high plane of heaven, while denser matter sank to create the terrestrial realm where humanity would eventually make its home. This cosmological model provides a framework for understanding how the Age of Heaven might have functioned as a literal reality rather than mere mythology. The gods did not rule from some distant, invisible realm, but maintained their civilization at the literal peak of the world, where the air was thin enough to touch the stars, and the perspective broad enough to encompass every ocean and continent simultaneously. From these lofty heights, they could observe the gradual development of mortal civilization, while remaining sufficiently removed to avoid the petty concerns that plague earthbound existence. The separation between divine and mortal realms was not absolute, but rather resembled the relationship between teachers and students, with knowledge and power flowing downward in carefully measured doses. The various races that would later worship the sun god, the sky people with their wings that remembered flight, the Lunarians with their flames that echoed the sun's own fire, the giants whose massive forms suggested divine heritage, the buccaneers whose strength carried echoes of ancient power, all retained fragments of their connection to the heavenly realm long after direct contact had been severed. Yet something changed during those distant centuries, something that transformed the Age of Heaven from a living reality into a collection of half-remembered legends. The gods did not simply vanish like morning mist touched by sunlight, nor were they destroyed in some cosmic catastrophe that left the world scarred and broken. Instead, they underwent a transformation that was both deliberate and mysterious, a conscious choice to withdraw from direct involvement in worldly affairs, while ensuring that their influence would continue through more subtle means. The creation of the Sea Circle calendar marks not just a change in how time was measured, but the moment when divine authority began its transition into mortal hands. Year zero of this new system represents the point at which the Grand Line came into existence, that impossible ring of ocean that defies every known law of navigation and meteorology. Unlike the Red Line, which appears to be a natural, if improbable, geological formation, the Grand Line bears all the hallmarks of deliberate construction, a project so massive in scope that it could only have been accomplished through divine intervention. This great work may have been the final collaborative effort between the departing gods and the emerging powers that would inherit their world. The Grand Line serves as both barrier and pathway, dividing the oceans into distinct sections while simultaneously providing a route for those brave or foolish enough to attempt its navigation. Its magnetic fields, its bizarre weather patterns, its islands that seem to exist outside normal temporal flow, all of these phenomena suggest that the Grand Line functions according to rules established by beings whose understanding of natural law transcended mortal comprehension. The timing of this great work coincides with the emergence of what scholars now refer to as the Great Kingdom, that mysterious civilization whose very existence poses such a threat to the current world order that its name has been erased from official histories. If the Age of Heaven ended with the withdrawal of the gods, then the Great Kingdom may have represented the first attempt by mortals to maintain the level of civilization and harmony that had existed under divine rule. The advanced technology, the profound understanding of ancient weapons, the ability to create poneglyphs that could preserve information across millennia, All of these achievements suggest a society that had inherited not just knowledge, but wisdom from their divine predecessors. The transition was neither smooth nor complete, however, and the evidence suggests that not all gods chose to withdraw from worldly affairs at the same time or in the same manner. Some may have lingered, attempting to guide the development of mortal civilization through direct intervention. Others might have chosen to preserve their essence in forms that could survive the transition, embedding their power in objects or locations that would remain accessible to future generations. Still others may have made the ultimate sacrifice, allowing their divine nature to fragment into smaller pieces that could be inherited by mortals through what we now recognize as devil fruits. The pattern of divine powers manifesting through devil fruits becomes particularly compelling when viewed through this historical lens. The sun god Nika's abilities now reside in Luffy's Gomu Gomu no Mi, but this may represent not the arbitrary assignment of power to an unusual rubber fruit, but the carefully planned inheritance of divine authority by someone deemed worthy of such responsibility. Similarly, the forest god's power may manifest through Aramaki's abilities, the storm god's influence through Dragon's weather manipulation, and the earth god's strength through various terrain-altering fruits that have appeared throughout history. This interpretation transforms devil fruits from random supernatural phenomena into a deliberate system designed to ensure that divine power remained available to mortals without requiring the continued presence of gods themselves. Each fruit becomes a sacred trust, a fragment of divine essence entrusted to someone capable of wielding such power responsibly. The apparent randomness of who consumes which fruit may actually reflect a deeper pattern, a cosmic selection process that ensures power flows to those who need it most at precisely the moment when circumstances demand divine intervention. The Age of Heaven thus represents not a completely separate era, but the foundation upon which all subsequent history has been built. Every major conflict, every significant discovery, every moment of transformation in the world's ongoing story can be traced back to decisions made and systems established during those ancient centuries, when gods and mortals shared the same sky. The world government's desperate attempts to suppress knowledge of this period reflect their understanding that awareness of divine history would fundamentally undermine the legitimacy of their authority. For if people understood that the current world order represents not natural evolution but a deviation from principles established by beings far wiser and more powerful than any mortal ruler, the entire structure of contemporary society would become untenable. The celestial dragon's claim to godlike authority becomes laughably transparent when measured against memories of what true divine rule once provided. The systematic oppression and artificial scarcity that characterize modern governance stand in stark contrast to the abundance and harmony that apparently flourished under heavenly administration. As we drift deeper into contemplation of these vast temporal distances, we begin to understand that the Age of Heaven was not simply a time period, but a state of being, a way of organizing reality that prioritized harmony between all living things over the domination of the strong, over the weak. The gods who ruled during this era were not tyrants demanding worship, but gardeners tending a cosmic ecosystem, ensuring that every element had its place and purpose within the larger pattern. The echoes of their influence continue to reverberate through every generation, appearing in the dreams of those who dare to imagine better worlds, in the courage of those who stand against overwhelming odds, in the bonds of friendship that prove stronger than any force the current age can muster against them. The Age of Heaven ended not with defeat, but with transformation. The gods choosing to trust mortals with the responsibility of continuing their work through means that would prove more durable than direct divine intervention. In the gentle rhythm of waves against distant shores, in the whisper of wind through ancient forests, in the patient turning of stars across the vast night sky. The influence of that forgotten age continues its eternal work. The gods may have withdrawn from sight, but their greatest creation, the potential for mortals to transcend their limitations and create something worthy of divine approval, remains as active today as it was in those distant centuries when heaven and earth existed in perfect harmony among the countless mysteries that shroud the age of heaven in veils of forgotten time. None captivates the imagination quite like the tale of the Lunarians, those magnificent beings whose very existence challenged the boundary between mortal flesh and divine essence. These children of flame and starlight once soared through skies that knew no darkness, their wings carrying them between the earthly realm and the celestial heights where gods held court in palaces built from crystallized moonbeams and woven aurora. King stands as the last testament to their grandeur, a solitary figure whose massive frame and eternal flames serve as living proof that legends sometimes walk among us long after the world has forgotten their origins. His black wings, which span distances that dwarf even the most impressive human architecture, carry within their feathered expanse the memory of an entire civilization that once claimed dominion over the highest peaks of creation. When he spreads those wings against the backdrop of storm clouds and lightning, observers catch glimpses of what the world once looked like when divine beings moved freely between heaven and earth. The flames that crown his head burn with an intensity that suggests they draw their fuel from sources far more profound than mere combustion, reaching back through genetic memory to touch the original fire that once illuminated the land of gods. These are not the flickering flames of torches or candles, but something far more elemental, the physical manifestation of a connection to cosmic forces that predate the formation of continents and the birth of oceans. Every tongue of fire that dances above his dark hair carries within it the echo of stars being born in distant nebulae, the whisper of solar winds that have traveled across impossible distances to deliver messages written in languages older than speech itself. Queen's revelation about King's heritage came wrapped in the casual cruelty that characterizes so much of the modern world's relationship with ancient knowledge, yet beneath his mocking tone lay an acknowledgement of truths so profound that they shatter conventional understanding of what constitutes divine nature. When he identified King as a remnant of the extinct Lunarians, describing them as monsters capable of surviving in any natural environment, he was not merely cataloguing biological capabilities, but recognizing the fundamental difference between beings created for transcendence and those bound by terrestrial limitations. The casual manner in which Queen dismissed the Lunarians' extinction, telling Sanji to ask a history book rather than attempting to provide explanation, reveals the systematic way in which knowledge of the age of heaven has been compartmentalized and hidden from general understanding. The suggestion that books themselves might serve as sources of direct communication rather than passive repositories of information hints at possibilities that extend far beyond conventional scholarship, suggesting that the line between living knowledge and recorded fact may be far thinner than most people assume. The Lunarians' recognition as gods during their prime was not honorary title bestowed by grateful worshippers, but accurate description of beings whose nature transcended the categories that normally define mortal existence. Their survival capabilities, which Queen described in terms of environmental adaptation, actually reflect something far more profound: the ability to exist in harmony with cosmic forces that would destroy lesser beings instantly. They could survive in the vacuum between stars because they carried within themselves fragments of the stellar fire that illuminates the universe. They could withstand the crushing pressures of oceanic depths because their bones contained minerals that remembered the weight of mountains being born from tectonic collision. The mystery of their extinction becomes even more poignant when viewed through the lens of their divine nature, for beings capable of surviving any natural environment should not have succumbed to mere physical forces. The question that Sanji posed during his battle, if they were so perfectly adapted for survival, why did they all die? Cuts to the heart of what the Age of Heaven's conclusion actually meant for those who had lived as bridges between mortal and divine realms. Their extinction was not biological failure, but spiritual transformation, a conscious choice to withdraw from a world that was transitioning toward patterns of existence that no longer required their direct intervention. The mythological foundations that underpin the Lunarians' existence reach back to some of humanity's oldest stories about the relationship between divine messengers and mortal recipients of celestial knowledge. The Yatagarasu, that three-legged crow who served as divine messenger of the sun goddess in ancient Japanese tradition, appears in some of the earliest written records of human civilization and continues to influence cultural understanding of how divine will manifests in the physical world. This creature, often depicted as wreathed in flames that echo the sun's own radiance, served as guide and herald for mortals who had been chosen to receive divine favor or instruction. The parallels between this mythological figure and the Lunarians extend far beyond superficial similarities of fire-based powers and aerial mastery, reaching into fundamental questions about the role that divine messengers play in the cosmic order. Just as Yatagarasu guided legendary figures toward destinies that would reshape entire civilizations, the Lunarians served as intermediaries between the gods of the Age of Heaven and the mortal races who would inherit responsibility for maintaining cosmic balance after divine withdrawal became inevitable. King's ancestral home atop the Red Line carries significance that extends far beyond mere geographical location, representing the literal intersection between heavenly and earthly realms where divine authority once manifested most directly in the physical world. The peaks that crown the Red Line reach toward altitudes where mortal lungs struggle to extract oxygen from air that grows thin enough to touch the lower boundaries of space itself. At these heights, where the curve of the planet becomes visible and the vastness of the cosmos stretches out in all directions, the Lunarians maintained their civilization as guardians of the threshold between worlds. Eiichiro Oda's earliest map of the One Piece world, sketched in 1999 as he prepared to guide his characters into the Grand Line's mysteries, contains a curious notation that may represent more than mere coincidence. Among the various islands and territories marked on this foundational document appears a location simply labeled King's House. Positioned remarkably close to where Mariehua now stands as the world government's seat of power, while this may represent nothing more than the author's early conceptual work, the possibility that it indicates King's literal ancestral home adds layers of meaning to the world government's choice of location for their headquarters. The decision to establish the center of world government, precisely where divine beings once maintained their primary residence on the earthly plane, suggests either profound ignorance of the location's sacred significance or deliberate appropriation of divine authority through geographical conquest. If the latter interpretation proves accurate, then every proclamation issued from Mariehua, every law imposed by the celestial dragons, every act of oppression committed in the name of world order represents not just political tyranny, but spiritual blasphemy, the systematic desecration of sacred ground by those who lack any legitimate claim to the power they day wield. King's connection to Joy Boy's eventual return reveals the patience that characterizes truly divine perspective on temporal progression. demonstrating how beings whose lifespans encompass centuries or millennia approach prophecy and promise-keeping in ways that mortal minds struggle to comprehend. For over 800 years, through the rise and fall of kingdoms, through the systematic erasure of historical knowledge, through countless cycles of oppression and resistance, King maintained his vigil, waiting for signs that would herald the return of liberation itself in mortal form. This waiting was not passive resignation, but active preparation. The cultivation of strength and wisdom necessary to recognize and support the prophesied figure when he finally appeared. Every battle King fought, every alliance he forged, every moment of survival against impossible odds served as training for the role he would eventually play in Joy Boy's return. His association with Kaido, despite the beast's fundamental misunderstanding of what true strength represents, provided him with opportunities to hone his abilities while maintaining the anonymity necessary for protecting knowledge that the world government would kill to suppress. The loneliness that must have accompanied such an extended vigil defies easy comprehension, representing isolation not just from his own extinct people, but from anyone capable of understanding the true nature of his mission. To carry the weight of divine heritage in a world that had forgotten the god's existence, to serve as living repository of knowledge that most beings would dismiss as fantasy, to maintain faith in promises made during an age that history claims never existed, these burdens would have crushed spirits less perfectly forged in the fires of genuine divinity. Yet King's endurance through these trials demonstrates something profound about the nature of divine inheritance and the responsibilities that accompany it. His strength comes not from mere physical prowess or devil fruit abilities, but from connection to purposes that transcend individual existence, anchoring his identity in service to ideals that will outlast any single lifetime or civilization. The flames that burn eternally above his head serve as visible reminder that some lights refuse to be extinguished, regardless of how much darkness surrounds them. The Lunarian's fire-based abilities represent far more than convenient tactical advantages in combat situations, manifesting as physical expressions of their connection to cosmic forces that govern stellar formation and planetary evolution. Their flames burn without consuming fuel because they draw energy directly from the same sources that power stars across the galaxy, tapping into nuclear processes that convert matter into radiance, according to principles that transcend conventional understanding of chemistry and physics. This connection to stellar fire explains not only their incredible resilience, but also their role as divine messengers and guides for mortal races seeking enlightenment. Just as stars serve as navigational references for travelers crossing vast oceanic distances, the Lunarians served as reference points for civilizations attempting to navigate the complex moral and spiritual challenges that define existence in the physical realm. Their presence reminded mortals of their connection to cosmic processes, while their guidance helped prevent the kind of spiritual drift that leads to civilizations losing their way in pursuit of purely material concerns. The tragedy of their extinction becomes even more poignant when viewed through the lens of what the world lost when their voices fell silent and their flames were extinguished. Without their guidance, mortal civilizations became increasingly susceptible to the kind of corruption that transforms legitimate authority into tyrannical oppression, that mistakes power for strength and domination for leadership. The rise of the world government and the systematic suppression of knowledge that characterizes the current age can be traced directly to the absence of voices capable of providing divine perspective on mortal concerns. King's survival as the sole representative of his people carries implications that extend far beyond individual tragedy, representing hope that the divine perspective has not been completely lost from the world, despite centuries of systematic suppression. His presence serves as proof that divine heritage can survive even the most comprehensive attempts at erasure, that the connection between mortal and celestial realms remains intact despite the world government's best efforts to sever it permanently. The awakening of Nika's power in Luffy represents the fulfillment of prophecies that King has carried in his heart for longer than most civilizations have existed, validating patience that lesser beings would have abandoned long before seeing its ultimate purpose fulfilled. The moment when Gear 5th manifested for the first time must have struck King with recognition so profound that it transcended mere confirmation of ancient predictions, representing instead the restoration of patterns that had been interrupted for so long that the world had forgotten what genuine divine intervention looked like when it finally arrived. As we contemplate the vast sweep of time that encompasses King's story, from his people's extinction to his eventual recognition of Joy Boy's return, we begin to understand that the Lunarians represent something more than just another lost civilization or extinct species. They embody the possibility that divine qualities can survive in mortal forms, that the transition from the Age of Heaven to the current era was not complete abandonment, but careful preservation of essential elements in forms that could endure until the time came for their renewal. King's black wings continue to cast shadows across skies that have forgotten what it means to be graced by divine presence. Yet those shadows carry within them the promise that darkness is temporary and that the sun god's return will eventually illuminate truths that have been hidden for far too long. In the patience of his waiting, in the strength of his survival, in the flames that refuse to be extinguished, we see reflected the eternal nature of divine purpose and the certainty that some promises transcend even the apparent finality of extinction itself. In the vast pantheon of divine beings who once walked among mortals during the Age of Heaven, no figure looms larger in the imagination or carries more profound implications for the world's ultimate destiny than the sun god Nika, whose very name whispers promises of liberation that echo across centuries like light breaking through storm clouds after the longest night. This was not merely another deity among many, but the embodiment of freedom itself, the cosmic force that opposed tyranny wherever it manifested, the divine spark that ignited hope in hearts that had forgotten what it meant to dream of better tomorrows. Nika's role within the heavenly pantheon transcended simple hierarchical positioning, representing instead a fundamental principle that governed how divine power should relate to mortal need. Where other gods might have wielded authority through displays of overwhelming force or demanded worship through demonstrations of terrible retribution, Nika's divinity manifested through joy, through laughter that could shatter the chains of oppression, through the kind of infectious optimism that transforms despair into determination. The sun god's power was not the power to dominate, but the power to liberate. Not the strength to crush enemies, but the strength to free friends from whatever circumstances held them captive. The worship of Nika spread across the ancient world not through conquest or coercion, but through the simple recognition that freedom represented the most fundamental of all divine gifts, the prerequisite without which all other blessings became meaningless. The Sky People, with their wings that carried memories of unfettered flight, understood instinctively that Nika's domain encompassed not just physical liberation, but spiritual transcendence, the ability to rise above earthly constraints and touch the infinite possibilities that existed beyond the horizon of immediate experience. Among the clouds where Sky Island civilizations flourished, temples dedicated to Nika were built not as monuments to divine power, but as celebrations of the freedom that divine power existed to protect and nurture. These were places where the oppressed could find sanctuary, where slaves could discover their true worth, where anyone who had been told they were less than human could remember that divine spark that burns within every conscious being, regardless of their circumstances or the labels that society had imposed upon them. The giants of Elbaf, whose massive forms and centuries-long lifespans provided them with perspectives that dwarfed mortal concerns, recognized in Nika something that transcended even their own impressive scale of existence. Their worship took the form of great festivals where laughter echoed across entire islands, where the joy of freedom was celebrated with such intensity that the very mountains trembled in sympathetic resonance. These gatherings were not mere religious observances, but collective expressions of the understanding that true strength lay not in the ability to impose one's will upon others, but in the courage to stand against those who would impose their will unjustly. The warrior culture of Elbaf, with its emphasis on honorable combat and worthy adversaries, found in Nika's teachings a framework for understanding when violence served liberation and when it merely perpetuated cycles of oppression. The sun god's influence taught them that the strongest warriors were not those who never lost battles, but those who never lost sight of what they were fighting for, who never allowed victory to corrupt their understanding of justice or defeat to diminish their commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves. The Buccaneers, that proud seafaring race whose very existence challenged the world government's attempts to categorize and control human diversity, carried Nika's worship across oceans that had never known the touch of divine blessing. Their ships served as floating temples where freedom of movement became a form of prayer, where the act of sailing beyond the horizon represented faith in possibilities that could not be seen, but could certainly be reached by those brave enough to chase them. Bartholomew Kumar's tragic transformation from free buccaneer to mindless weapon of the world government represents one of the most profound violations of Nika's principles ever perpetrated: the systematic destruction of everything that made an individual unique and valuable in service to power structures that treated human beings as interchangeable components in their machinery of control. Yet even in his mechanized state, some spark of his original devotion to the sun god persisted, manifesting in actions that protected those whom the system sought to destroy. The transition from Nika as living deity to Nika as inherited power through devil fruit represents one of the most significant transformations in the world's spiritual evolution, marking the moment when divine authority began its deliberate migration from celestial realms into mortal hands. This was not abandonment or defeat, but careful succession planning on a cosmic scale, ensuring that the principles embodied by the sun god would survive the end of the age of heaven and continue to influence world events through individuals deemed worthy of such tremendous responsibility. Joy Boy's inheritance of Nika's power marked the first great experiment in divine succession, testing whether mortal beings could wield godly abilities while maintaining the humility and wisdom necessary to use such power in service of liberation rather than domination. The advanced civilization of the great kingdom that flourished under his leadership provided evidence that this experiment succeeded beyond even the most optimistic projections, creating a society where freedom and order coexisted in harmony, where strength served justice rather than replacing it. The technologies that the Great Kingdom developed under Joy Boy's guidance represent attempts to democratize divine power, to create tools and systems that could extend the benefits of godly abilities to entire populations rather than limiting them to single inheritors. The ancient weapons, rather than instruments of destruction, may have been devices designed to protect freedom on a global scale, ensuring that no tyrant could ever again impose their will upon populations too scattered or too weak to resist through conventional means. The poneglyphs themselves can be understood as Joy Boy's attempt to preserve not just historical knowledge but spiritual wisdom, ensuring that future generations would have access to the understanding necessary to recognize divine succession when it occurred, and to support the inheritors of godly power in fulfilling their cosmic responsibilities. The indestructible nature of these stone tablets reflects the understanding that some truths are too important to be lost to the passage of time or the destructive impulses of those who profit from ignorance. Joy Boy's promise to the Fishman Island, sealed in poneglyph form and preserved for over 800 years, demonstrates the kind of long-term thinking that characterizes divine perspective on mortal concerns. This was not merely a political agreement between allied nations, but a spiritual covenant that transcended the limitations of individual lifespans, a commitment that would be honored not by Joy Boy himself, but by his spiritual successor when the time came for such promises to be fulfilled. The tragedy of Joy Boy's apparent failure during the Void Century takes on different dimensions when viewed through the lens of divine succession and cosmic timing. What appeared to be defeat may actually have been strategic withdrawal, recognition that the world was not yet ready for the kind of transformation that Nika's full power could accomplish. The 100 years of hidden history may represent the time needed for conditions to develop that would make successful divine intervention possible, rather than merely spectacular. The Will of D, that mysterious inheritance that connects individuals across centuries and continents, begins to make sense as the bloodline through which Nika's influence was preserved during the long night that followed the Age of Heaven's conclusion. These were not merely individuals who shared genetic heritage, but carriers of spiritual DNA, people whose very existence challenged the world government's attempts to create a reality based on hierarchy and control rather than freedom and mutual respect. Dragon's revolutionary activities, viewed through this lens, represent not just political rebellion but spiritual restoration, the systematic dismantling of systems that violate divine principles in favor of structures that honor the inherent worth and freedom of every conscious being. His weather-controlling abilities may reflect inherited fragments of storm god power, but his true strength lies in his understanding that lasting change requires transformation of hearts and minds, rather than simple replacement of one tyranny with another. Garp's position within the Marines, while maintaining his connection to the Will of D, demonstrates the complex ways that divine inheritance can manifest in a world where open acknowledgement of such heritage invites persecution. His ability to fight for justice within corrupt institutions while never fully surrendering his independence represents the kind of moral navigation that divine wisdom makes possible, the capacity to serve legitimate authority while refusing to enable tyranny. Ace's tragic fate illustrates the terrible cost that divine heritage can impose upon those who carry it. The way that spiritual inheritance can become a burden too heavy for individual shoulders to bear without the support of communities that understand its significance. His execution was not simply the world government's punishment for his father's crimes, but their attempt to eliminate bloodlines that carried memories of divine justice and divine freedom. The awakening of Nika's power in Monkey D. Luffy represents the culmination of centuries of careful preparation, the moment when all the conditions necessary for successful divine intervention finally aligned to make transformation possible rather than merely desirable. Luffy's journey from rubber-powered pirate to liberated god demonstrates the patience that divine forces exercise when working within mortal timeframes, allowing character to develop and wisdom to mature before granting access to power that could reshape the world. Gear 5's manifestation during the battle with Kaido was not random timing but cosmic synchronicity, the universe itself recognizing that the moment had arrived for divine intervention to tip the balance between oppression and freedom decisively in favor of liberation. The laughter that accompanied this awakening was not mere expression of joy, but the sound of reality itself celebrating the return of principles that had been suppressed for far too long. The rubber properties that had defined Luffy's abilities throughout his journey revealed themselves as preparation for godhood rather than limitation upon it. each stretched punch and elastic dodge serving as practice for the kind of creative problem-solving that divine power requires when applied to real-world challenges. The awakening did not replace these characteristics but fulfilled them, showing how apparent limitations can become sources of unlimited strength when viewed from divine perspective. The impact of Nika's return extends far beyond Luffy's individual transformation, sending ripples across the entire world as the suppressed memories of divine justice begin to resurface in hearts that had forgotten what true freedom looked like. The Joy Boy drums that echo across Wano as Gear 5th manifests represent not just celebration but awakening, the sound of a world remembering what it had lost and preparing to reclaim it. The liberation of Wano under Nika's influence provides a template for what divine intervention looks like when applied with wisdom earned through mortal experience, demonstrating how godly power can dismantle oppressive systems without destroying the communities that had been forced to exist within them. The abundance that follows Kaido's defeat reflects divine principles made manifest. The understanding that true prosperity comes not from hoarding resources, but from sharing them freely. As we drift deeper into contemplation of Nika's role in both ancient and modern times, we begin to understand that the sun god's influence represents something more than supernatural intervention in mortal affairs. Nika embodies the recognition that freedom is not privilege to be earned or gift to be granted, but fundamental aspect of existence itself, as natural and necessary as sunlight, as inevitable and persistent as the tide. The cycles of oppression and liberation that define so much of recorded history take on new meaning when viewed through the lens of divine succession, revealing patterns that suggest cosmic forces working across vast timescales to ensure that tyranny never achieves permanent victory over the human spirit. Each generation that rises up against injustice carries within it sparks of the same divine fire that once burned openly during the Age of Heaven, proving that some lights cannot be extinguished, regardless of how much darkness surrounds them. In the laughter of children who refuse to accept that the world must always be cruel, in the determination of revolutionaries who persist despite overwhelming odds, in the bonds of friendship that prove stronger than any force that seeks to divide people from one another, Nika's influence continues to manifest even when its divine source remains hidden from conscious recognition. The sun god's greatest victory may not be the dramatic awakening of power in chosen inheritors, but the quiet persistence of hope in ordinary hearts that have never stopped believing in the possibility of better tomorrows. The promise that Nika represents, that freedom will ultimately triumph over oppression, that joy will overcome despair, that light will always return no matter how long the night, continues to echo across the centuries like waves breaking against distant shores, carrying within its rhythm the certainty that divine justice may be patient, but it is also inevitable. As sure as the sun's return each morning to illuminate a world that divine love has never truly abandoned, when the gods of the Age of Heaven made their fateful decision to withdraw from direct governance of mortal affairs, they faced a dilemma that would have challenged even divine wisdom: how to ensure that their essential powers remained accessible to a world that would inevitably face challenges requiring intervention beyond normal human capabilities. The solution they devised speaks to both their profound love for creation and their deep understanding of how power must be distributed to avoid the corruption that inevitably accompanies its concentration in too few hands. The fragmentation of divine essence into what mortals would eventually recognize as devil fruits represents one of the most elegant solutions to the problem of succession ever conceived, allowing godly abilities to manifest through individuals whose character and circumstances made them worthy vessels for such tremendous responsibility. Rather than attempting to preserve their power in single, overwhelming concentrations that might tempt inheritors toward tyranny, The departing deities chose to scatter their abilities like seeds across the world, trusting that cosmic forces would guide these fragments toward those who would use them wisely. The forest god's magnificent power, which once commanded every growing thing from the smallest wildflower to the mightiest ancient oak, now manifests through Admiral Ryokugyu, known as Green Bull, whose Mori Mori no Mi abilities demonstrate how divine plant manipulation can be wielded in service to human institutions. Yet the irony of this inheritance cannot be overlooked. Power that once nurtured growth and protected natural harmony now serves a world government whose policies systematically destroy the very ecosystems that divine forest powers were meant to preserve and celebrate. Green Bull's ability to absorb nutrients directly through photosynthesis, to create and manipulate plant matter on a massive scale, to drain the life force from other living beings through root systems that can penetrate any substance. These capabilities echo techniques that the forest god once used to maintain the delicate balance between growth and decay that kept ancient ecosystems thriving for millennia. The divine power that once ensured that every species had its place in the great web of life now serves political objectives that treat nature as nothing more than raw material to be exploited for short-term gain. The tragedy of this misalignment becomes particularly apparent when we consider how forest god abilities could transform the world if applied according to their original divine purpose. Deserts could bloom with life-giving vegetation, polluted landscapes could be cleansed through accelerated plant growth that absorbed toxins and converted them into harmless compounds, and food scarcity could be eliminated through divine manipulation of agricultural systems. Instead, these powers serve to maintain an artificial hierarchy that treats abundance as privilege rather than birthright. The storm god's tempestuous legacy carries even more complex implications for understanding how divine succession manifests in the modern era, for weather has always represented one of the most direct ways that cosmic forces interact with earthly concerns. Monkey D. Dragon's ability to command wind and lightning speaks to inherited fragments of power that once shaped climates across entire continents, ensuring that each region received precisely the amount of rain and sunshine necessary for optimal flourishing of whatever life forms had chosen to make their homes there. Dragon's revolutionary activities take on profound theological dimensions when viewed through the lens of storm god inheritance, suggesting that his rebellion against the world government represents not merely political opposition but cosmic correction of systems that violate natural law. The storms that follow in his wake are not random meteorological phenomena, but expressions of divine displeasure with human institutions that create artificial scarcity in a world capable of producing abundance for all. The Revolutionary Army's systematic dismantling of oppressive governments can be understood as weather patterns restored to their proper function, clearing away stagnant systems that prevent natural circulation of resources and opportunities, bringing the lightning that illuminates truths that corrupt authorities prefer to keep hidden, generating the winds of change that carry seeds of justice to places where they can take root and flourish according to divine intention. The irony that Dragon's son inherited the sun god's power, while the father carries storm god abilities, suggests that divine succession follows patterns more complex than simple hereditary transmission, with cosmic forces ensuring that related powers remain within family lines that have demonstrated capacity for wielding them responsibly. The combination of solar liberation and tempestuous transformation within a single bloodline creates possibilities for environmental and social change that exceed what either power could accomplish independently. The rain god's influence permeates weather patterns across the world in ways so subtle that most observers dismiss them as natural phenomena rather than recognizing the divine intelligence that continues to guide precipitation toward areas where it will do the most good. The timing of crucial rainfalls that have turned the tide of important battles, the droughts that have weakened corrupt governments, the floods that have washed away evidence of crimes that would otherwise have remained hidden. These events suggest ongoing divine intervention through meteorological manipulation. Unlike the more dramatic manifestations of storm and forest powers, rain god abilities seem to operate through influence rather than control, nudging natural weather systems toward configurations that serve divine justice rather than overriding atmospheric processes entirely. This approach reflects the understanding that subtle guidance often proves more effective than overwhelming force when the goal is long-term transformation rather than immediate gratification. The scattered manifestations of rain god power through various weather-manipulating devil fruits across history suggest that this divine essence fragmented more thoroughly than others, perhaps reflecting the rain god's decision to maintain influence across broader geographical areas, rather than concentrating power in single inheritors. Nami's climate-enhanced abilities, while artificially augmented rather than naturally inherited, demonstrate how mortal ingenuity can amplify fragments of divine influence when applied with sufficient understanding and determination. The Earth God's legacy presents perhaps the most complex example of divine fragmentation, with geological manipulation abilities scattered across numerous devil fruit users, whose powers range from simple stone creation to manipulation of tectonic forces that can reshape entire landscapes. The breadth of Earth-related abilities suggests that geological divinity proved particularly difficult to preserve intact, requiring division into specialized aspects that could be maintained by different inheritors. Pika's Ishi no Mi, demonstrated large-scale stone manipulation that echoes techniques the Earth God once used to sculpt mountain ranges and carve river valleys, yet his application of these powers in service to Doflamingo's corrupt rule represents another tragic example of divine abilities being perverted to serve purposes that violate their original intention. The Earth God's power was meant to create foundations for civilizations that would honor natural harmony, not to build fortresses for tyrants who treat the planet as their personal property. The magma manipulating abilities of Admiral Akainu represent Earth God power in its most destructive aspect, geological forces unleashed without the tempering wisdom that originally guided their application. Where the divine Earth God once used volcanic activity to renew soil fertility and create new land masses for expanding life, Sakazuki's magma serves only to eliminate those who oppose world government authority, transforming creative geological power into purely destructive force. The more subtle Earth God inheritances found in devil fruits that manipulate soil composition, control seismic activity, or alter gravitational fields suggest that geological divinity, scattered across a broader range of specific applications than other divine powers, perhaps reflecting the Earth God's understanding that solid matter requires more careful handling than wind or water or growing things. Each fragment represents specialized knowledge about how geological forces can be applied to support rather than suppress the flourishing of life. Isho's gravity manipulating abilities through his Zushi no Mi demonstrate how Earth God power can manifest through control of fundamental forces rather than direct manipulation of matter, suggesting that divine geological authority encompassed understanding of physics that transcends simple rock-moving capabilities. His moral application of these inherited powers, in service to justice rather than institutional authority, hints at what Earth God abilities might accomplish if their full divine purpose were understood and embraced. The systematic way these divine powers have been co-opted by institutions that oppose their original purpose reflects the world government's unconscious recognition that controlling fragments of divine authority provides legitimacy that purely human power structures could never achieve on their own. By recruiting devil fruit users whose abilities echo ancient divine powers, the Marines and other governmental organizations attempt to appropriate the moral authority that once belonged to the gods themselves. Yet this strategy contains the seeds of its own failure, for divine power cannot be permanently severed from divine purpose without eventually rebelling against the constraints that seek to contain it. Greenbull's plant manipulation will eventually recognize the ecological destruction that his current allegiances support. Dragon's storm power will continue to generate the chaos necessary for systematic change, and Earth manipulating abilities will inevitably shift towards supporting foundations that can bear the weight of justice rather than oppression. The awakening of these inherited divine powers to their true purpose represents one of the most significant threats that the world government faces, though they may not fully understand the theological dimensions of their predicament. As more devil fruit users begin to recognize the divine heritage that their abilities represent, the artificial systems that have channeled godly power toward corrupt ends will find themselves increasingly unable to maintain the loyalty of those whose strength makes their authority possible. The connection between ancient divine worship and modern devil fruit abilities becomes particularly apparent when examining how different cultures have preserved traditions that honor the gods whose powers now manifest through individual inheritors. The reverence for natural forces that characterizes many traditional societies reflects inherited memory of times when these powers operated under divine guidance, suggesting that the proper application of godly abilities requires reconnection with wisdom traditions that the world government has systematically suppressed. The temples and shrines dedicated to forest spirits, storm deities, rain gods, and earth powers that can be found scattered across various islands represent repositories of knowledge about how divine abilities should be applied for maximum benefit to all living things. These sacred sites may hold keys to understanding how fragmented divine powers could be reunited with their original purpose, providing guidance for current inheritors who struggle to comprehend the full scope of their responsibilities. The gradual rediscovery of divine principles through practical application of inherited powers suggests that cosmic forces continue to guide worthy inheritors toward understanding that transcends what formal education or institutional training could provide. Each devil fruit user who chooses to honor the divine heritage that their abilities represent contributes to a growing awakening that threatens to restore the age of heaven's principles through mortal agency rather than direct divine intervention. The prophecies and ancient texts that speak of divine powers returning to proper alignment gain new significance when viewed through the lens of devil fruit inheritance, suggesting that the gods' withdrawal from direct world governance was always intended as temporary measure rather than permanent abandonment. The scattered fragments of divine essence are slowly coalescing around worthy inheritors whose combined actions will eventually restore the harmony that once characterized relationships between cosmic forces and earthly communities. As we contemplate the vast network of divine influence that continues to operate through seemingly disparate devil fruit abilities, we begin to understand that the age of heaven never truly ended but simply transformed its methods of operation. The gods still guide the world's development toward justice and abundance, but now they work through mortal agents whose individual choices determine whether divine power serves its original purpose of liberation or becomes corrupted into tools of oppression. that violate everything the ancient deities represented. The Great Kingdom emerges from the mists of forgotten history, not as a conventional nation-state built through conquest and territorial expansion, but as something far more extraordinary. A civilization that represented the first successful attempt to translate divine principles into mortal governance, bridging the vast chasm between the age of heaven's departed gods and humanity's fumbling attempts to create societies worthy of the world they had inherited. This was not merely another powerful empire seeking dominion over weaker neighbors, but a revolutionary experiment in applying cosmic wisdom to the practical challenges of organizing millions of lives across thousands of islands scattered throughout the world's vast oceans. The mysterious founder of this unprecedented civilization remains shrouded in anonymity that speaks to either the systematic destruction of historical records or the deliberate choice to emphasize principles over personality, allowing the kingdom's achievements to stand as testament to divine inheritance rather than individual genius. Yet the scope and sophistication of what was accomplished under their leadership suggests someone who possessed not merely exceptional administrative skills or military prowess, but access to knowledge and power that transcended normal human limitations. The possibility that this founding figure inherited the sun god Nika's abilities creates a compelling framework for understanding how divine succession might have operated during the crucial transition period between heavenly rule and mortal governance. If Joy Boy was indeed this mysterious founder, then his inheritance of the sun god's powers would have provided both the moral authority and practical capabilities necessary to establish a civilization based on principles of liberation rather than domination, abundance rather than scarcity, cooperation rather than competition. The timeline of divine transition becomes particularly significant when we consider that the Great Kingdom's emergence coincides with the final phases of the Age of Heaven's conclusion, suggesting that the gods did not simply vanish into cosmic obscurity, but actively participated in transferring their authority to worthy mortal successors. This process would have required careful selection of inheritors whose character and wisdom could be trusted with powers capable of reshaping entire continents, whose vision encompassed not just immediate political objectives, but long-term civilizational development across multiple generations. The advanced civilization that flourished under the Great Kingdom's guidance demonstrates what becomes possible when divine power serves its intended purpose of elevating all life rather than enriching privileged elites at the expense of everyone else. The technologies they developed, the social systems they implemented, the cultural achievements they fostered, all point to a society that had successfully integrated cosmic wisdom with practical governance, creating conditions where human potential could flourish without the artificial constraints that characterize most historical civilizations. The poneglyphs themselves represent perhaps the most tangible evidence of the Great Kingdom's divine inheritance, for their creation required understanding of materials, science, and information preservation that exceeded anything achievable through conventional human knowledge. These indestructible stone tablets were not simply record-keeping devices, but repositories of wisdom designed to survive whatever cataclysms might befall the world, ensuring that future generations would have access to the understanding necessary to rebuild civilization according to divine principles. Should the current experiment in mortal governance fail catastrophically, the decision to scatter these stone records across the world, rather than concentrating them in secure archives, reveals strategic thinking that transcended normal concerns about information security, reflecting understanding that knowledge becomes most powerful when it cannot be controlled or suppressed by any single authority. Each poneglyph was positioned to serve as seed of awakening for communities ready to embrace the responsibilities that divine inheritance demanded, while remaining hidden from those whose intentions would corrupt such knowledge into tools of oppression. The road poneglyphs that hold the key to reaching Laughtale represent the Great Kingdom's most sophisticated legacy, encoding navigational information that requires not just technical skill to decipher, but spiritual readiness to comprehend. The final island where the One Piece awaits discovery was not chosen arbitrarily, but represents a location where the full truth about divine succession and cosmic purpose could be revealed safely to those who had proven themselves worthy. Through their journey across the Grand Line's many challenges, the advanced weaponry that the Great Kingdom developed takes on entirely different implications when viewed through the lens of divine inheritance rather than mere technological achievement. Pluton, Poseidon, and Uranus were not instruments of destruction designed to intimidate enemies, but tools for protecting freedom on a global scale, ensuring that no tyrant could ever impose their will upon populations too scattered or too weak to resist through conventional means. Their terrible power was matched by equally sophisticated safeguards that prevented their misuse by those whose motivations violated the divine principles that had guided their creation. The systematic way the world government has sought to suppress knowledge of these ancient weapons reflects their understanding that such devices were designed specifically to prevent the kind of centralized tyranny that their rule represents, that the Great Kingdom's military technology posed an existential threat not to innocent populations, but to corrupt power structures that depended on artificial scarcity and systematic oppression for their continued existence. The Great Kingdom's approach to international relations reveals how divine wisdom applies to the complex challenges of coordinating multiple civilizations while respecting their individual cultures and traditions. Rather than imposing uniformity through conquest, they appear to have created voluntary alliances based on mutual benefit and shared commitment to principles that honored the divine spark within every conscious being, regardless of their species, size, or geographical origin. The fishmen's reverence for Joy Boy, preserved through 8 centuries of waiting for his promised return, demonstrates the kind of loyalty that authentic divine authority can inspire when exercised with genuine respect for those who choose to offer their allegiance. This was not submission extracted through fear or dependency created through artificial limitations, but partnership freely chosen by beings who recognized that cooperation with divinely guided leadership served their own interests as well as the greater good. The Giants' continued respect for Joy Boy's memory, maintained through countless generations whose individual lifespans encompassed entire centuries, speaks to relationships built upon foundations solid enough to endure whatever political upheavals might reshape the surface of international affairs. Their willingness to support his eventual successor, despite having no direct experience with his leadership, suggests that divine authority carries its own validation, recognizable to those whose wisdom transcends the immediate circumstances of any particular era. The Sky People's preservation of Nolan's story and their continued faith in promises made 400 years ago reflects the Great Kingdom's success in creating bonds that transcended the normal limitations of political alliances, establishing connections based on shared values rather than temporary strategic advantages. Their loyalty to Joy Boy's memory persisted even when direct contact became impossible, demonstrating the kind of trust that only authentic divine inheritance can generate and sustain across vast temporal distances. The revolutionary potential that the Great Kingdom represented becomes particularly apparent when we consider how thoroughly the world government has worked to erase not just historical knowledge of its existence, but even the possibility that such a civilization could have existed at all. the systematic destruction of libraries, the elimination of scholars who possessed relevant knowledge, the transformation of surviving records into forbidden texts whose mere possession carries death sentences, all point to recognition that the Great Kingdom's example posed an existential threat to every justification the current world order offers for its authority. The 20 kingdoms that eventually coalesced into the world government were not simply rival powers seeking territorial expansion, but representatives of fundamentally different approaches to civilization itself, champions of hierarchy and scarcity, opposing a system based on equality and abundance. Their victory during the Void Century was not mere military triumph, but ideological conquest, the systematic replacement of divine principles with human pride, cosmic wisdom with institutional expedience. The true tragedy of the Great Kingdom's fall lies not in the destruction of buildings or the death of individuals, but in the loss of a working model for how human civilization could operate according to divine principles, how mortal governments could serve their populations rather than exploiting them, how international relations could be conducted through cooperation rather than domination. The world lost not just a powerful nation, but a proof of concept that alternative approaches to organizing society were not only possible, but superior to the systems that replaced them. The cultural achievements of the Great Kingdom, glimpsed through fragmentary references in ancient texts and archaeological discoveries that the world government has not yet succeeded in suppressing entirely, suggest a civilization where arts and sciences flourished because they served to elevate the human spirit rather than glorify temporal authority. Their music, their literature, their architectural achievements, their philosophical developments, all were directed toward helping people understand their connection to cosmic forces rather than reinforcing artificial hierarchies that separated rulers from subjects. The economic systems that the Great Kingdom developed appear to have transcended the scarcity-based models that characterize most human societies, creating abundance through divine understanding of natural processes rather than accumulating wealth through exploitation of others' labor. Their agricultural techniques, their manufacturing methods, their resource distribution networks all seem to have operated according to principles that honored the regenerative capacity of natural systems rather than depleting them for short-term profit. The educational institutions of the Great Kingdom preserved and transmitted not just technical knowledge but wisdom about how individual development related to collective flourishing, how personal growth served cosmic purposes, how each person's unique contributions enhanced the strength and beauty of the whole civilization. Their scholars were not mere collectors of facts, but cultivators of understanding, guides who helped others discover their own divine inheritance, rather than authorities who hoarded knowledge to maintain their privileged positions. The military organization of the Great Kingdom represented perhaps their most radical innovation, creating defense forces whose primary mission was protecting freedom rather than enforcing obedience, whose strength lay in their commitment to justice rather than their capacity for destruction. Their warriors fought not to conquer territory or accumulate tribute, but to ensure that tyranny could not take root anywhere in their sphere of influence, that oppression would be met with overwhelming resistance regardless of where it might emerge. The spiritual life of the Great Kingdom appears to have integrated worship of various divine powers into coherent understanding of how cosmic forces operated through natural processes and human activities alike. Their temples were not monuments to institutional authority, but gathering places where communities could reconnect with divine principles, where individuals could receive guidance about how their personal choices related to larger patterns of cosmic development. The decline and fall of this extraordinary civilization during the Void Century represents more than political defeat or military conquest. marking instead the moment when humanity chose to reject divine guidance in favor of systems that promised immediate gratification at the expense of long-term flourishing. The 20 Kingdoms' victory was not triumph of superior strategy or overwhelming force, but success in convincing populations that freedom was too dangerous to preserve, that abundance was too expensive to maintain, that divine inheritance was too burdensome for mortal shoulders to bear. Yet the great kingdom's legacy persists in forms that no amount of historical revision can eliminate entirely, embedded in the geographical features that their technologies created, preserved in the genetic memories of races that participated in their civilization, encoded in the very structure of reality through modifications that continue to influence world events, centuries after their creators have been reduced to legends that most people dismiss as fantasy. The approaching rediscovery of the Great Kingdom's true history through Luffy's journey toward Laugh Tale represents more than simple historical curiosity or archaeological achievement, marking instead the potential restoration of divine principles to a world that has suffered under human pride and institutional corruption for far too long. The One Piece that awaits discovery may not be treasure in any conventional sense, but the key to understanding how mortal civilization can once again align itself with cosmic wisdom, how divine inheritance can resume its proper function of elevating all life rather than enriching privileged elites. As we drift deeper into contemplation of this lost golden age, we begin to understand that the Great Kingdom was not historical accident or temporary deviation from normal patterns of human development, but glimpse of what becomes possible when mortals accept their divine inheritance with the humility and wisdom necessary to wield such power in service to life itself rather than personal ambition or institutional pride. In the shadowed halls of Mariéchois, where marble columns reach toward vaulted ceilings that have witnessed 8 centuries of systematic deception, there sits upon the empty throne a figure whose very existence challenges every assumption the world has made about the nature of divine power and its relationship to mortal authority. Imu represents perhaps the most profound mystery in all the tangled web of history that connects the Age of Heaven to our current era, a being whose true nature may bridge the impossible gap between departed gods and ascending tyrants in ways that transform our understanding of both divine succession and human corruption. The possibility that Imu is the last surviving deity from the Age of Heaven, a stubborn remnant who refused to withdraw from worldly affairs when the other gods chose transcendence over direct governance, casts the entire structure of the world government in a radically different light. If this interpretation proves accurate, then the systematic oppression that has characterized the past 8 centuries represents not mere human evil but divine rebellion, the corruption of cosmic power by a being who possessed the strength to enforce their will but lacked the wisdom to apply it justly. The Umibozu of Japanese folklore provides a compelling mythological framework for understanding what manner of divine being Imu might represent. For these creatures of oceanic darkness have always embodied the sea's capacity for both creation and destruction, its power to nurture life while simultaneously threatening to reclaim everything it has given. These beings appear in the oldest maritime legends as entities of pure shadow with glowing eyes that pierce the deepest night, creatures that rise from abyssal depths to test the courage and character of those who dare to traverse their domain. The visual similarities between traditional Umibozu depictions and the glimpses we have been granted of Imu's true form suggest connections that transcend mere artistic coincidence, pointing toward the possibility that this figure represents oceanic divinity, corrupted by centuries of isolation and unchallenged authority. Where Umibozu traditionally served as guardians of oceanic balance, testing sailors to ensure that only those with pure intentions could complete their voyages safely, Imu appears to have transformed this divine function into systematic persecution of anyone whose existence threatens their vision of proper world order. The 20 kingdoms that eventually coalesced into the world government may have begun as legitimate resistance to divine tyranny, mortal powers uniting to oppose a god whose understanding of justice had become twisted by too many centuries of absolute authority without accountability. Their victory during the Void Century would then represent not the triumph of human ambition over divine wisdom, but the successful rebellion of mortals against a deity who had forgotten that power existed to serve life rather than commanding worship from it. The irony of this interpretation becomes particularly bitter when we consider how thoroughly the descendants of those original rebels have embraced the very tyranny they once fought to overthrow, transforming themselves into the world nobles, whose casual cruelty and systematic oppression exceed anything that even a corrupted god might have imposed upon their subjects. The celestial dragons represent the worst of both divine and mortal nature, wielding power they never earned, while lacking any of the cosmic wisdom that might justify such authority. The establishment of Mariéchois on the sacred grounds that once served as the land of gods reveals the calculated nature of this usurpation, the deliberate choice to build their new order literally on top of the foundations that had supported divine civilization during the Age of Heaven. This was not random selection of a strategically advantageous location, but symbolic conquest, the physical manifestation of their intention to replace divine authority with human institutions, regardless of the cost in suffering or injustice that such replacement might require. The transformation of the Red Line's Peak from a place where gods maintained harmony between heaven and earth into a fortress where false gods enforce artificial scarcity represents one of the most profound blasphemies ever committed, the systematic perversion of sacred geography to serve purposes that violate everything the original inhabitants represented. Every law imposed from Mariéchois, every act of oppression committed in the name of world order, every moment of suffering inflicted to maintain the current hierarchy compounds this original sin of geographical desecration. Imu's centuries-long campaign against the legacy of the sun god Nika suggests a personal vendetta that transcends mere political opposition, pointing toward conflicts that may have originated during the Age of Heaven when divine beings still interacted directly with one another. If Imu represents oceanic darkness in opposition to Nika's solar liberation, then their eternal struggle encompasses fundamental questions about how cosmic forces should relate to mortal existence, whether divine power should serve to free conscious beings or bind them to structures that ensure stability at the expense of growth. The systematic destruction of historical knowledge that has characterized the world government's approach to information control takes on theological dimensions when viewed through the lens of divine succession and cosmic authority. The elimination of scholars who possessed fragments of ancient wisdom, the transformation of libraries into funeral pyres, the criminalization of archaeological research, all serve not just political objectives but spiritual purposes, ensuring that mortals remain ignorant of their divine inheritance and the cosmic principles that should govern their development. The Ohara incident represents the most comprehensive example of this deliberate ignorance creation, the annihilation of an entire scholarly community whose only crime was seeking to understand the true history of their world. The scholars who died in that conflagration carried within their minds knowledge that could have restored divine principles to a world increasingly dominated by systems that treated conscious beings as resources to be exploited rather than spirits to be nurtured toward their full potential. The five elders, who serve as Imu's intermediaries with the outside world, embody the corruption that inevitably results when mortal beings attempt to wield authority that transcends their understanding. Their twisted wisdom reflecting centuries of exposure to cosmic power without access to the divine principles that should guide its application. Their titles, as warrior gods, represent not legitimate spiritual authority, but blasphemous appropriation of divine terminology to justify actions that violate every principle the original gods represented. The black magic circles that appear whenever Imu exercises their most profound powers suggest abilities that transcend conventional devil fruit categories, pointing toward forms of cosmic manipulation that operate according to rules established during the Age of Heaven, rather than the limitations that govern mortal inheritance of divine fragments. These manifestations of pure will, made manifest, speak to power that has never been diminished by the kind of fragmentation that scattered other divine abilities across multiple inheritors. The possibility that Imu's authority stems from legitimate divine inheritance rather than usurped mortal ambition creates profound moral complexity around the question of resistance to their rule. For opposing a true God requires justifications that transcend simple political disagreement or institutional reform. Yet the corruption of divine purpose that Imu's reign represents may actually make resistance more rather than less necessary. For allowing cosmic power to serve oppression rather than liberation violates fundamental principles that govern how divine authority should relate to mortal existence. The prophecy surrounding Joy Boy's return takes on apocalyptic dimensions when viewed as cosmic correction of divine abuse rather than mere political revolution, suggesting that the approaching final conflict will determine not just who rules the world, but what principles will guide future relationships between power and responsibility. Luffy's inheritance of Nika's abilities represents the restoration of authentic divine authority to a world that has suffered under corrupted cosmic power for far too long. The drums of liberation that echo across the world when Gear 5th manifests announce not just the return of the sun god's power, but the beginning of divine reckoning with those who have perverted cosmic authority for selfish ends. The laughter that accompanies this awakening carries within it the promise of justice that transcends human concepts of punishment and reward, cosmic restoration of principles that no amount of institutional power can permanently suppress. The world government's increasingly desperate attempts to eliminate Luffy and suppress knowledge of his true nature reflect their recognition that authentic divine succession poses an existential threat to systems built upon the loose corruption of cosmic principles, that the return of genuine godly authority will expose the illegitimacy of everything they have constructed over 8 centuries of systematic deception. Their fear stems not from concern about losing political control, but from understanding that divine justice, once fully awakened, will reshape the world according to principles that leave no room for the artificial hierarchies that have defined their existence. The ancient weapons that the world government seeks to control or destroy represent attempts by the Great Kingdom to create safeguards against exactly the kind of divine corruption that Imu's reign embodies. Tools designed to ensure that cosmic power could never again be monopolized by single entities whose understanding of justice had been twisted by isolation and unchallenged authority. Their terrible, destructive potential reflects not malicious intent, but recognition that sometimes the most profound acts of creation require the complete elimination of structures too corrupt to be reformed. The approaching convergence of Joy Boy's return, the ancient weapons activation, and the world's growing awareness of its true history promises a reckoning that will determine whether divine power returns to its proper function of liberating conscious beings, or remains trapped in service to systems that treat oppression as order and scarcity as stability. The outcome of this cosmic struggle will reshape not just political boundaries, but the fundamental relationship between power and responsibility that governs how conscious beings relate to one another. As we contemplate the vast scope of deception and corruption that has characterized Imu's reign, we begin to understand that the world government represents not merely human evil but divine power, perverted to serve purposes that violate everything cosmic authority was meant to accomplish. The liberation that Nika's return promises extends beyond political freedom to encompass spiritual restoration, the return of divine principles to a world that has forgotten what authentic cosmic authority looks like when wielded with wisdom rather than corrupted by isolation and pride. The patience that cosmic forces have demonstrated in allowing this corruption to persist for 8 centuries speaks not to indifference or weakness, but to understanding that lasting change must emerge from authentic choice rather than imposed correction, that mortals must develop the wisdom necessary to recognize and support genuine divine authority, rather than having it forced upon them by powers they neither understand nor trust. The approaching transformation represents not divine conquest of mortal institutions, but mortal recognition of cosmic principles that have been waiting centuries for worthy inheritors to claim their birthright and restore harmony between heaven and earth. In the depths of time that stretch beyond human memory, where centuries blur together like waves merging with the endless sea, there walk among us beings whose very existence serves as living testimony to epochs so ancient that even the stones have forgotten the names of those who first carved meaning into their surfaces. These are the eternal witnesses, creatures whose punishment or blessing has bound them to lifespans that encompass not merely individual generations but entire cycles of civilization, carrying within their memories fragments of truth that connect our present age to the divine foundations upon which all reality ultimately rests. Zunesha stands as perhaps the most magnificent and tragic of these ancient witnesses, a creature whose punishment for crimes committed during the Age of Heaven has transformed him into a living island, forever walking the ocean floors, while carrying upon his massive back an entire civilization that exists in ignorance of the cosmic justice that guides their perpetual journey. For over 1,000 years, this colossal elephant has traced paths across the world's oceans that follow currents older than recorded history, his route determined not by random wandering, but by divine mandate that continues to unfold according to patterns established when gods still walked openly among mortals. The weight of guilt that Zunesha carries transcends anything that mortal beings could comprehend, for his crime was committed during a time when actions possessed consequences that rippled across entire eras rather than being contained within single lifetimes. The nature of his transgression remains shrouded in mystery that may be deliberately preserved, for some knowledge proves too dangerous to share with those who lack the wisdom necessary to understand how cosmic justice operates across temporal scales that dwarf human experience. Yet even in punishment, Zunesha serves purposes that reveal the profound mercy that characterizes authentic divine justice, his eternal wandering, ensuring that the Mink tribe continues to exist in freedom rather than facing extinction at the hands of those who would exploit their unique abilities for political or military advantage. The electro powers that flow through every member of their race represent fragments of divine electrical force that once illuminated the Age of Heaven, capabilities too valuable to be lost to world-reshaping conflicts that have consumed so many other remnants of cosmic authority. The island that grows upon Zunesha's back functions as more than mere geographical feature, serving instead as repository of knowledge and culture that preserves ways of life that existed during humanity's golden age of divine guidance. The Mink tribe's natural harmony with electrical forces, their instinctive understanding of how individual strength can serve collective purposes, their willingness to sacrifice everything for principles that transcend immediate self-interest, All reflect values that flourished when gods provided direct guidance for mortal development. The ancient forests that crown Zunesha's mobile island contain trees whose roots extend deep enough to touch the elephant's own nervous system, creating symbiotic relationships that allow the island's inhabitants to communicate with their living foundation in ways that demonstrate how consciousness can exist across scales of existence that mortal minds struggle to comprehend. These connections reveal truths about the nature of life itself that challenge conventional assumptions about where individual identity ends and collective existence begins. The libraries hidden within Zu's ancient trees preserve texts written during the Age of Heaven, documents that survive not through human preservation efforts, but through integration with living systems that repair and maintain themselves, according to principles that transcend normal biological processes. These repositories contain knowledge about how divine powers operated in their original forms, wisdom about cosmic principles that governed reality before mortal institutions began their systematic campaign to replace divine truth with human convenience. The Sea Kings who populate the deepest oceanic trenches represent another category of eternal witness, creatures whose lifespans encompass multiple millennia and whose memories extend back to the earliest days of divine interaction with mortal civilizations. Their immense size and profound intelligence reflect inheritance from an age when physical form followed spiritual development, rather than being limited by genetic programming or environmental constraints that characterize modern biological systems. Princess Shirahoshi's ability to command these ancient beings reveals the persistence of divine succession, even in forms that appear to have no connection to conventional devil fruit inheritance, demonstrating how cosmic authority can manifest through bloodlines that carry genetic memory of times when such communication was commonplace rather than miraculous. Her powers represent not random mutation or supernatural gift, but restoration of capabilities that once defined normal interaction between conscious beings of different species and scales of existence. The ancient voice that allows certain individuals to hear the thoughts and emotions of Sea Kings operates according to principles that predate the development of human language, tapping into forms of communication that existed during the Age of Heaven when divine beings maintained direct telepathic connection with every conscious entity within their domain. This ability reveals how consciousness itself functions as universal force that transcends the biological boundaries that appear to separate different forms of life. The Sea King's role as guardians of Poseidon reflects their function as protectors of oceanic balance, ensuring that no single power can monopolize control over the seas that connect all inhabited lands and make global civilization possible. Their loyalty to authentic divine authority serves as safeguard against the kind of corruption that has characterized terrestrial power structures, maintaining oceanic freedom as foundation for whatever legitimate global government might eventually emerge from the ashes of the current world order. The creatures that populate Thriller Bark represent perhaps the most mysterious category of ancient witnesses, beings whose origins predate conventional understanding of how life and death relate to consciousness and identity. These monsters exist in states that challenge normal categories of living and dead, suggesting that during the Age of Heaven, the boundaries between different modes of existence were far more fluid than they have become under mortal management of natural processes. The ancient magic that animates these beings operates according to principles that transcend devil fruit powers or conventional supernatural phenomena, drawing instead upon forces that were commonplace during the divine era but have become increasingly rare as the world's spiritual atmosphere has grown thinner under the influence of materialistic institutions that deny the existence of anything that cannot be measured and controlled through purely physical means. Brooks' unique relationship with death and resurrection provides glimpses into how consciousness functioned during the Age of Heaven, when spiritual identity possessed sufficient independence from biological form to survive transitions that would destroy ordinary beings entirely. His musical abilities, which can influence souls directly rather than merely affecting emotional states through auditory stimulation, demonstrate how artistic expression once served as bridge between mortal and divine realms. The ancient ruins scattered across various islands throughout the Grand Line contain architectural features that defy conventional understanding of how stone can be shaped and positioned, revealing construction techniques that required either divine intervention or technology so advanced that it approaches magic from the perspective of current capabilities. These structures were built to last not merely centuries but entire geological epochs, ensuring that evidence of the Age of Heaven would survive whatever catastrophes might befall subsequent civilizations. The giant creatures that inhabit these ruins, from the massive goldfish that threaten navigators to the colossal insects that patrol forgotten temples, represent species that achieved their extraordinary size during periods when environmental conditions supported forms of life that transcend current biological limitations. Their continued existence serves as proof that the Age of Heaven left lasting changes in the world's fundamental systems, modifications that continue to influence natural development, despite 8 centuries of institutional attempts to suppress all evidence of divine intervention. The island whales like Laboon represent another form of eternal witness, creatures whose emotional capacity and memory span encompass multiple human generations, while maintaining psychological complexity that rivals or exceeds mortal intelligence. Laboon's 50-year vigil waiting for the Rumbar pirates' return demonstrates the kind of loyalty and hope that characterized relationships during the Age of Heaven, when bonds between conscious beings possessed spiritual dimensions that transcended immediate practical considerations. The ancient knowledge that these creatures possess about oceanic currents, weather patterns, and geographical features that no longer appear on modern maps provides navigation information that connects current maritime routes to patterns established when divine beings still guided global transportation systems. Their memories contain details about islands that have since sunk beneath the waves, civilizations that have vanished without trace in official records, and events that shaped world geography in ways that modern scholars cannot explain through conventional geological processes. The burden that these eternal witnesses carry extends beyond simple longevity to encompass responsibility for preserving truths that most of the world has forgotten or actively denies, serving as living libraries of experience that could restore understanding of how reality operated under divine guidance. Their suffering stems not from physical discomfort or material deprivation, but from spiritual isolation, the loneliness of possessing knowledge that few beings can comprehend, and fewer still would accept, even if they possessed the capacity for understanding. The gradual awakening of mortal beings to the significance of these ancient witnesses represents one of the most hopeful developments in the world's long journey towards spiritual restoration, as individuals like Luffy begin to recognize the profound wisdom that these creatures offer to those humble enough to listen, rather than assuming that human knowledge encompasses all truth worth knowing. Their willingness to share their memories with worthy recipients suggests that the time approaches when ancient wisdom will once again guide mortal development toward harmony with cosmic principles. The protection that these eternal beings provide to those who honor their heritage extends beyond mere physical assistance to encompass spiritual guidance that helps worthy individuals navigate the complex moral challenges that arise when divine inheritance begins to manifest in mortal forms. Their presence serves as a reminder that consciousness exists across scales and timeframes that dwarf human experience, that individual identity participates in patterns far larger than single lifetimes can encompass. The approaching restoration of communication between mortal inheritors of divine power and these ancient witnesses promises to bridge the gap between current ignorance and the comprehensive understanding that once characterized relationships between different forms of consciousness during the age of heaven. As more individuals develop the spiritual sensitivity necessary to perceive these connections, the isolation that has characterized both human civilization and eternal witnesses will give way to renewed cooperation in service to cosmic purposes that transcend the artificial boundaries created by institutional oppression. The knowledge that flows from these ancient sources will prove essential for navigating the transformations that accompany the return of authentic divine authority to a world that has forgotten how to receive such guidance gracefully, providing wisdom about how mortal institutions can align themselves with cosmic principles, rather than continuing the futile attempt to replace divine truth with human convenience that has characterized the past 8 centuries of systematic spiritual decline. As we drift deeper into contemplation of these timeless beings who carry within their memories the keys to understanding our true heritage, we begin to appreciate that loneliness itself can serve divine purposes when it preserves essential knowledge through periods when the world lacks the wisdom necessary to receive such gifts. Their patient endurance ensures that when the time comes for restoration, the foundations will exist upon which authentic cosmic order can once again flourish in harmony with mortal aspirations that honor rather than violate the sacred principles that govern all conscious existence. The Void Century stands as the most deliberately obscured chapter in all of recorded history, 100 years of systematic erasure that transformed the greatest divine conflict ever witnessed into nothing more than a blank space between the years 600 and 700 of the Sea Circle calendar, a chasm of missing knowledge so profound that even mentioning its existence carries penalties severe enough to discourage all but the most desperate scholars from pursuing its mysteries. This was not merely another war between competing human powers, but the final cataclysmic struggle between fundamentally incompatible visions of how reality itself should be organized. Divine principles clashing against mortal ambition in a conflict whose outcome would determine whether cosmic wisdom or human pride would guide the world's development for centuries to come. The participants in this ultimate confrontation were not merely armies and navies, but representatives of entirely different approaches to existence itself, forces that embodied cosmic principles so fundamental that their clash reshaped not only political boundaries, but the very nature of how consciousness relates to power, how individual will interact with collective responsibility, how mortal beings understand their relationship to divine heritage that has been scattered like seeds across the world's vast expanses of land and sea. On one side stood the Great Kingdom, that extraordinary civilization which had successfully bridged the gap between divine wisdom and mortal governance, demonstrating through practical application that societies could flourish when organized according to cosmic principles rather than hierarchical structures that concentrated power in the hands of those who mistook authority for wisdom and strength for virtue. Their leader, whether Joy Boy himself or someone who carried his spiritual inheritance, wielded not just the sun god Nika's liberation powers, but the accumulated wisdom of centuries, spent learning how divine abilities could serve mortal needs, without corrupting into the kind of tyranny that transforms liberation into another form of bondage. The advanced technologies that the Great Kingdom had developed represented more than mere scientific achievement. embodying instead the marriage of cosmic understanding with practical application that characterized all their endeavors during this golden age of divine mortal cooperation. The ancient weapons that would later become objects of terror and obsession were not instruments of conquest, but tools for protecting freedom on a planetary scale, devices whose terrible power was matched by equally sophisticated safeguards that prevented their misuse by those whose motivations violated the principles that had guided their creation. Pluton, with its capacity to destroy entire islands, was designed not as weapon of oppression, but as instrument of liberation, capable of eliminating fortress cities where tyrants had concentrated their power while leaving surrounding populations unharmed. Its creators understood that sometimes freedom could only be preserved through the complete elimination of structures so thoroughly corrupted that reformation had become impossible, that mercy itself sometimes required actions that appeared cruel to those who lacked cosmic perspective on the relationship between immediate suffering and long-term flourishing. Poseidon represented the oceanic dimension of divine protection, ensuring that no single power could monopolize control over the seas that connected all inhabited lands and made global communication possible. The Sea Kings who served this ancient weapon were not mindless creatures of destruction but conscious beings whose intelligence and loyalty had been earned through centuries of respectful cooperation rather than extracted through fear or domination, partners in maintaining oceanic balance rather than tools to be wielded without regard for their own needs and perspectives. Uranus, the most mysterious of the three great weapons, likely embodied divine authority over atmospheric and celestial forces, ensuring that weather patterns and astronomical phenomena served the cause of justice rather than being manipulated by those who would use natural disasters as tools of political control. Its power may have extended to communication across vast distances, coordination of resistance movements separated by thousands of miles of ocean, and even influence over the cosmic forces that determine when certain prophetic conditions align to permit divine intervention in mortal affairs. Against this magnificent civilization stood the alliance of 20 kingdoms, whose unity was forged not through shared principles, but through common fear of what the great kingdom represented, proof that alternative approaches to Disizi, organizing society, were not only possible, but superior to the hierarchical systems that had allowed them to accumulate power at the expense of their subjects' well-being. These rulers understood instinctively that the great kingdom's very existence challenged every justification they had ever offered for their authority, that its success in creating abundance and harmony made their own systems of artificial scarcity and systematic oppression appear not just cruel, but unnecessary. The 20 kingdoms' victory was achieved not through superior virtue or even military prowess, but through their willingness to embrace strategies that the great kingdom's adherence to divine principles prevented them from adopting, tactics that sacrificed long-term consequences for immediate tactical advantages without regard for the suffering. Such choices would inflict upon innocent populations caught between competing visions of how the world should be organized. The systematic destruction of historical records that followed their triumph was not mere political expedience but spiritual necessity, for allowing knowledge of the great kingdom's achievements to survive would have provided constant reminder that current systems of governance were chosen rather than inevitable, that alternatives existed, which could provide abundance and freedom without requiring the systematic oppression that characterized the emerging world government's approach to maintaining order through fear rather than inspiring loyalty through service. The transformation of the 20 kingdoms into the world government marked more than political consolidation but spiritual corruption on a cosmic scale. the gradual abandonment of whatever legitimate principles might have originally motivated their resistance to the Great Kingdom, in favor of systems that embraced the very tyranny they had supposedly fought to prevent. The celestial dragons, who emerged as the ultimate beneficiaries of this victory, embodied everything that was worst about both divine power, corrupted by isolation, and mortal ambition, unconstrained by wisdom. The true tragedy of the Void Century lies not in the military defeat of one civilization by another, but in the deliberate choice to replace wisdom with ignorance, cosmic principles with institutional convenience, divine inheritance with artificial hierarchy that treated conscious beings as resources to be exploited rather than spirits to be nurtured toward their full potential. The world did not simply lose a powerful nation, but abandoned a working model for how mortal civilization could operate in harmony with divine principles. The ancient weapons that had been created to protect freedom became objects of terror whose very existence justified the kind of authoritarian control that their original creators had sought to prevent, transformed from tools of liberation into symbols of the destruction that would supposedly result from challenging the world government's authority. The systematic suppression of knowledge about their true purpose ensured that fear would replace understanding, that ignorance would serve political objectives, that cosmic wisdom would have exposed as violations of every principle that gave legitimate authority its moral foundation. The poneglyphs that survived this comprehensive campaign of historical destruction represent more than mere record-keeping devices, serving instead as seeds of eventual awakening for future generations who would develop the wisdom necessary to understand how divine principles should guide mortal development. Their indestructible nature ensured that truth would persist regardless of how comprehensive the world government's attempts to replace reality with convenient fiction might become. The scholars of O'Hara, who died seeking to understand the Void Century, were not mere casualties of political paranoia, but martyrs to the principle that knowledge itself possesses inherent value that transcends whatever inconvenience its revelation might cause to those who benefit from systematic ignorance. Their sacrifice ensured that the questions they raised would eventually find answers, that the curiosity they embodied would inspire others to continue seeking truth despite the dangers such seeking might entail. The void that their elimination created in the world's intellectual life represents one of the most profound losses that any civilization can suffer, the systematic destruction of the very capacity for understanding how present circumstances relate to historical patterns that might inform wiser choices about future development. The world government's victory over these scholars was achieved not through superior argument or evidence, but through raw application of force against minds whose only crime was seeking to understand their world's true heritage. The Revolutionary Army's current activities can be understood as unconscious restoration of the resistance movements that once opposed the 20 Kingdoms campaign to replace divine wisdom with institutional oppression, modern attempts to address symptoms of spiritual corruption whose roots extend back to choices made during those hidden 100 years. Dragon's weather-manipulating abilities and his systematic opposition to world government authority echo patterns that emerged during the final divine conflict, suggesting that cosmic forces continue to generate resistance to systems that violate fundamental principles of justice and freedom. The will of D that connects individuals across centuries and continents represents the persistence of spiritual inheritance from the Great Kingdom and its divine allies, genetic and cultural memory that continues to generate opposition to tyranny despite 800 years of systematic persecution. Those who carry this mysterious middle initial seem drawn to conflicts that echo the ultimate struggle between liberation and oppression that define the Void Century, as if cosmic justice operates through bloodlines that remember what official histories have been designed to erase. The approaching convergence of ancient prophecies, the awakening of inherited divine powers, and the world's growing awareness of its suppressed heritage suggests that the Void Centuries conflicts were not permanently resolved but merely suspended, waiting for conditions to develop that would permit their ultimate resolution, according to principles that honor both divine wisdom and mortal aspiration. The patterns that drove that ancient struggle continue to operate beneath the surface of contemporary events, generating tensions that will eventually require resolution through either spiritual restoration or final victory of forces that treat consciousness as commodity rather than sacred trust. The one piece that awaits discovery at Laughtale may represent the key to understanding not just what happened during those hidden 100 years, but why such comprehensive suppression of historical knowledge was necessary to maintain systems that treat divine inheritance as threat rather than blessing, cosmic wisdom as danger rather than guidance. The truth that Gol D. Roger discovered and found so overwhelming may have been recognition that the world government's entire foundation rests upon lies so comprehensive that acknowledging them would require rebuilding civilization from principles upward. The laughter that gives Laughtale its name may reflect not amusement, but cosmic recognition of the irony that mortal beings have spent 8 centuries constructing elaborate systems to avoid responsibilities that divine inheritance makes inevitable, that all their efforts to suppress divine wisdom have only delayed rather than prevented the restoration of cosmic principles to a world that has forgotten what authentic spiritual authority accomplishes when wielded with proper understanding of its purposes and limitations. As we contemplate the vast scope of deception and spiritual corruption that emerged from the Void Centuries' hidden conflicts, we begin to understand that current world events represent not random political developments, but the final stages of cosmic drama that has been unfolding for nearly a millennium. The ultimate confrontation between systems based on divine wisdom and those founded upon human pride, approaching its inevitable resolution through means that will restore harmony between mortal aspiration and cosmic principle. The silence that surrounds those 100 missing years speaks not to successful historical suppression, but to truths so profound that even their enemies understood they could not be destroyed, only hidden, until the time came when the world had developed sufficient wisdom to receive them without being destroyed by the magnitude of transformation that such knowledge would necessarily require from every institution and individual that had benefited from systematic ignorance of divine heritage and cosmic responsibility. The geography of the One Piece world bears witness to divine intervention on a scale so vast that even the most ambitious mortal engineering projects pale in comparison to the continental-sized monuments that gods once carved into the very face of the planet itself. These are not mere natural formations shaped by mundane geological processes operating across millions of years, but deliberate architectural achievements that transformed entire hemispheres according to cosmic blueprints whose purposes encompassed far more than simple aesthetic grandeur or strategic military advantage. The Red Line stands as perhaps the most magnificent testament to divine architectural ambition, a continuous wall of stone and earth that circumnavigates the entire globe, like a massive ring encircling the planet's equatorial regions, with mathematical precision that defies any explanation rooted in conventional understanding of how continents form through tectonic drift and volcanic activity. This colossal barrier rises from oceanic depths to altitudes, where the air grows thin enough to touch the lower boundaries of space itself, creating a division between the world's major oceanic basins that fundamentally altered how weather patterns, ocean currents, and migratory routes would develop for all subsequent millennia. The engineering challenges that such construction would have presented to mortal civilizations remain so overwhelming that even modern technology, assisted by devil fruit powers, could not hope to duplicate this achievement, requiring capabilities that could move mountains as easily as children might rearrange building blocks, that could compact sedimentary layers with pressures normally found only in the deepest planetary core, that could coordinate construction activities across distances spanning multiple continents while maintaining structural integrity throughout the entire system. The summit of this impossible wall, where Mariahua now sits in blasphemous occupation of what was once the land of gods, reveals architectural features that speak to purposes far grander than merely providing elevated real estate for divine habitation. The vast plateaus that crown the Red Line's highest peaks were clearly designed as platforms for activities that required unobstructed views of the entire planetary surface, observatories from which cosmic intelligences could monitor the development of mortal civilizations while maintaining sufficient distance to avoid inadvertent interference with natural social evolution. The caves and tunnels that honeycomb the Red Line's interior structure suggest that this continental wall served not just as barrier, but as vast mechanism, housing systems whose purposes may have included climate control on a global scale, management of oceanic currents that distributed nutrients and maintained temperature balances across all the world's seas, and perhaps even gravitational manipulation that influenced tidal patterns according to schedules that served divine purposes, rather than merely following lunar cycles. The Grand Line presents an even more dramatic example of divine terraforming, for this ring of impossibly dangerous waters that circumnavigates the globe in perfect perpendicular intersection with the Red Line operates according to principles that violate every known law governing how oceanic systems should function under normal circumstances. The magnetic fields that render conventional navigation impossible, the weather patterns that shift with such violence that they can destroy entire fleets within minutes, the island ecosystems that develop in complete isolation from normal biological exchange, all point to artificial construction rather than natural evolution. The creation of this oceanic anomaly would have required divine powers capable of manipulating electromagnetic forces on a planetary scale, restructuring the very magnetic field that surrounds the entire world to create the navigation hazards that make Grand Line travel so treacherous for those who lack proper preparation and equipment. The energy expenditure necessary for such comprehensive electromagnetic engineering would have dwarfed the output of entire star systems. Yet the gods of the Age of Heaven accomplished this feat as part of their larger project of preparing the world for eventual transition from divine to mortal governance. The calm belts that border the Grand Line on both sides represent perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of this oceanic engineering project, zones of perpetual stillness where no wind blows and no currents flow, creating barriers that effectively isolate the Grand Line from the four cardinal seas, while providing habitats for the massive sea kings, whose presence ensures that only the most determined or foolhardy sailors attempt to cross these boundaries without proper authorization from cosmic authorities. The placement of sea king nests throughout the calm belts reflects careful ecological planning that balanced multiple objectives simultaneously, providing these ancient creatures with suitable habitats for their enormous size and specific dietary requirements while creating natural security, systems that could be activated when circumstances required isolation of the Grand Line from outside interference. The Sea Kings themselves may have been participants in this grand design rather than mere beneficiaries, their intelligence and longevity making them ideal guardians for oceanic systems too complex for shorter-lived species to maintain effectively. The islands scattered throughout the Grand Line reveal evidence of divine landscape architecture that transformed each location into specialized environments designed to serve specific functions within the larger system of mortal education and spiritual development. Some islands preserved climates and ecosystems from the Age of Heaven, maintaining samples of how the world had functioned under direct divine management for comparison with whatever systems mortal civilizations might eventually develop. Drum Island's perpetual winter serves as repository of Arctic conditions that existed during specific phases of the Divine Era, preserving not just cold weather ecosystems but atmospheric conditions that support forms of life adapted to the spiritual density that characterized heavenly environments. The medical knowledge that flourished on this island reflects understanding of how consciousness relates to physical health under conditions that approximate divine oversight of biological processes. Alabaster's vast deserts and ancient architecture preserve samples of the terrestrial environments that predominated during certain phases of the Age of Heaven, maintaining geological and atmospheric conditions that supported the kind of advanced civilization that the Great Kingdom would later develop under Joy Boy's guidance. The underground chambers that honeycomb the kingdom's bedrock contain evidence of construction techniques that required divine assistance to achieve the precision and durability that have allowed these structures to survive for thousands of years. Little Garden maintains samples of the gigantic ecosystems that flourished when divine oversight encouraged biological development, according to principles that favored size and longevity over the rapid reproduction and competitive struggle that characterizes life under purely natural selection. The giants Dory and Brogy serve as living examples of how conscious beings develop when their lifespans allow sufficient time for wisdom accumulation, rather than forcing all learning into the compressed timeframes that limit mortal development. The sky islands that float at altitudes impossible under normal atmospheric conditions represent divine experiments in three-dimensional landscape architecture, communities suspended in mid-air through manipulation of gravitational and electromagnetic forces that operate according to principles established during the Age of Heaven. These aerial civilizations preserve forms of social organization that developed when divine oversight ensured that competition for limited resources never became the driving force behind cultural evolution. The clouds that support these impossible communities are not mere water vapor but solidified atmosphere whose density and stability have been enhanced through divine intervention, creating solid surfaces capable of supporting entire cities while maintaining the flexibility necessary to accommodate weather changes and seismic events that would destroy conventional architecture. The dials that preserve and release various forms of energy represent technology that interfaces directly with these divine atmospheric modifications. Laughtale occupies a unique position within this grand system of divine landscape architecture, serving as the final destination for those who demonstrate sufficient wisdom and determination to navigate all the Grand Line's challenges, while maintaining the spiritual purity necessary to comprehend whatever ultimate truths await discovery at the journey's end. Its concealment from normal log pose detection reflects security measures that transcend simple geographical hiding, involving manipulation of space-time itself to ensure that only those who possess the road poneglyph's guidance can locate this most sacred of all destinations. The island's very name suggests that its primary function involves revelation of truths so profound that they trigger the kind of laughter that accompanies cosmic understanding, the recognition of patterns so vast and elegant that initial comprehension produces joy rather than mere intellectual satisfaction. The One Piece that awaits discovery. There may not be treasure in any conventional sense, but access to understanding, that transforms one's entire relationship to existence itself. The underwater kingdoms that flourish in the deepest oceanic trenches represent divine experiments in adapting surface-dwelling consciousness to environments that challenge every assumption about what conditions are necessary for advanced civilization. Fishman Island's massive bubble that maintains atmospheric conditions suitable for air-breathing visitors while preserving the aquatic environment that its primary inhabitants require demonstrates engineering principles that merge multiple environmental systems without compromising the integrity of either. The sunlight tree Eve that provides illumination for these deep-sea communities operates according to principles that transcend conventional photosynthesis, channeling solar energy across oceanic distances and depths that should prevent any surface light from reaching the communities that depend upon its radiance. This biological engineering marvel represents one of the most sophisticated examples of divine intervention in natural processes, creating sustainable illumination systems that function independently of normal atmospheric conditions. The coral formations that provide structural foundations for underwater architecture display growth patterns that reflect conscious design rather than random biological development. Their shapes and orientations clearly plan to support specific construction projects while maintaining the living flexibility necessary to accommodate seismic events and changing oceanic conditions. These organic building materials represent partnership between divine intelligence and natural systems that achieved capabilities exceeding what either could accomplish independently. The volcanic islands that provide geothermal power for various Grand Line communities reflect divine management of geological processes, ensuring that magma flows and volcanic activity serve constructive rather than purely destructive purposes. The hot springs that provide healing properties, the geothermal vents that power advanced manufacturing processes, the mineral deposits that support metallurgy beyond normal technological capabilities, all suggest that even the planet's most violent geological forces were channeled to serve divine purposes during the Age of Heaven. The magnetic anomalies that make conventional navigation impossible throughout the Grand Line represent not random interference but carefully orchestrated chaos designed to prevent casual travel while ensuring that determined voyagers develop the skills and wisdom necessary to handle greater challenges that await them on islands deeper within the system. Each magnetic disturbance serves as both obstacle and teaching tool, forcing navigators to develop intuitive understanding of oceanic systems that transcends reliance on mechanical instruments. As we drift deeper into contemplation of these vast geographical monuments to divine ambition and cosmic wisdom, we begin to understand that the entire world serves as classroom designed to educate mortal beings about their relationship to forces that transcend individual existence, that every island and ocean current carries lessons about how consciousness can learn to harmonize with cosmic principles, rather than fighting against patterns too large for any single perspective to encompass fully. The approaching rediscovery of divine purpose behind these geographical features promises to transform human understanding of their world from collection of random locations connected by dangerous waters into coherent system designed to support spiritual development on a planetary scale, recognition that will restore proper relationship between mortal ambition and cosmic guidance that has been missing since the Age of Heaven's conclusion. The threads that connect the Age of Heaven to our current era weave themselves through contemporary events with such intricate precision that even the most observant scholars might dismiss these patterns as mere coincidence, rather than recognizing them as evidence of cosmic forces continuing their eternal work through mortal agents who remain largely unaware of the divine heritage that guides their most crucial decisions. These are not random parallels but deliberate echoes, the reverberations of ancient conflicts that have never truly been resolved. manifesting now through individuals and organizations whose actions unconsciously mirror the great struggles that once determined whether divine wisdom or human pride would shape the world's fundamental character. The revolutionary army that operates under Dragon's leadership represents far more than simple political resistance to corrupt governance, embodying instead the unconscious restoration of principles that guided the Great Kingdom during its golden age of divine-mortal cooperation. Their systematic opposition to artificial hierarchies, their commitment to liberating oppressed populations regardless of the personal costs such liberation might entail, their understanding that lasting change requires transformation of hearts and minds rather than mere replacement of one set of rulers with another, all echo patterns established during the Age of Heaven, when divine beings worked to elevate mortal consciousness rather than demanding worship or submission. Dragon's weather-manipulating abilities serve as visible manifestation of inherited storm god powers, but his true significance lies in how those abilities serve purposes that transcend individual ambition or even revolutionary objectives. Every tempest he generates, every wind that carries his forces to new battlefields, every lightning strike that illuminates injustices previously hidden in darkness, these meteorological phenomena represent cosmic correction of atmospheric patterns that have been distorted by 8 centuries of world government, attempts to control even the natural forces that should serve all living beings rather than enriching privileged elites. The Revolutionary Army's organizational structure reflects understanding of how authentic authority operates through inspiration rather than coercion, their commanders earning loyalty through demonstrated commitment to principles rather than demanding obedience through displays of overwhelming force. This approach echoes the management techniques that divine beings employed during the Age of Heaven, when leadership meant accepting responsibility for others' well-being rather than exploiting positions of trust for personal advantage. The intelligence networks that the Revolutionary Army has established across the world's many islands operate according to principles that honor the dignity of every individual who chooses to participate, treating information, sharing as mutual cooperation rather than extraction of resources from expendable assets. Their success in maintaining security while preserving the humanity of their operatives demonstrates how organizations can function effectively without adopting the dehumanizing techniques that characterize world government intelligence operations. The bloodlines that carry the will of D represent perhaps the most direct connection between ancient divine heritage and contemporary events, genetic and spiritual inheritance that continues to generate opposition to systems based on oppression and artificial scarcity. Those who bear this mysterious middle initial seem drawn to conflicts that echo the ultimate struggle between liberation and tyranny that defined the Void Century, as if cosmic justice operates through family lines that remember what official histories have been designed to erase. Monkey D. Luffy's journey from rubber-powered dreamer to awakened inheritor of divine authority demonstrates how cosmic forces work across generations to ensure that worthy individuals develop the character and wisdom necessary to wield godly powers responsibly when circumstances finally align to permit their manifestation. His encounters with various forms of oppression, his instinctive opposition to hierarchies that treat conscious beings as commodities, his ability to inspire loyalty through genuine care for others' well-being, all reflect spiritual inheritance that transcends simple genetic transmission. Monkey D. Garp's position within the Marines, while maintaining independence that allows him to serve justice rather than institutional convenience, represents the complex moral navigation that divine inheritance requires in a world where open acknowledgement of such heritage invites persecution. His ability to work within corrupt systems while never fully surrendering his principles demonstrates how cosmic wisdom can manifest through individuals who understand that sometimes the greatest service requires apparent compromise with lesser evils to prevent greater catastrophes. Portgas. D. Ace's tragic fate illustrates how divine heritage can become burden too heavy for individual shoulders to bear, without the support of communities that understand its significance. The way that spiritual inheritance can attract persecution that exceeds what normal human strength can endure alone. His execution represented the world government's desperate attempt to eliminate bloodlines that carried memories of divine justice and cosmic freedom. Their recognition that some genetic lineages posed existential threats to systems based on systematic suppression of human potential. The ancient prophecies that speak of Joy Boy's return and the dawn of a new age take on immediate relevance when viewed through the lens of current events, suggesting that the convergence of inherited divine powers, awakening ancient weapons, and global awareness of suppressed historical knowledge creates conditions that make transformation inevitable rather than merely possible. These are not vague predictions about distant futures, but precise descriptions of cosmic patterns that operate according to schedules determined by forces far larger than any individual lifetime. The timing of Luffy's Devil Fruit awakening during the battle with Kaido represents more than random occurrence, marking instead the moment when cosmic forces determined that conditions had finally aligned to permit divine intervention on the scale necessary to tip the balance between oppression and liberation decisively toward freedom. The drums of liberation that echoed across Wano as Gear 5th manifested announce not just individual transformation, but planetary awakening to possibilities that have been suppressed for 8 centuries. The liberation of Wano under Nika's influence provides template for understanding how divine power applies to practical challenges of dismantling oppressive systems while preserving the communities that had been forced to exist within them. The abundance that followed Kaido's defeat demonstrates what becomes possible when resources are distributed according to cosmic principles, rather than artificial scarcity designed to maintain hierarchical control over populations, capable of producing prosperity for all. The Straw Hat Grand Fleet that has formed around Luffy's leadership represents unconscious recreation of alliance structures that supported the Great Kingdom during its golden age, voluntary associations based on shared principles, rather than coercive relationships maintained through fear or economic dependency. Each crew that has chosen to serve under Luffy's banner demonstrates how authentic authority attracts loyalty through inspiration, rather than demanding submission through intimidation. The diverse backgrounds and abilities represented within this grand fleet echo the inclusive approach that characterized divine governance during the Age of Heaven, recognition that strength comes through cooperation between different perspectives rather than uniformity imposed through suppression of individual uniqueness. Giants and humans, fishmen and sky islanders, former enemies transformed into allies, all contribute specialized capabilities that enhance the whole alliance while preserving their distinct cultural identities. The Marines who have begun questioning their institutional loyalty in response to encounters with Luffy and his crew represent awakening moral awareness that threatens the world government's ability to maintain control through military force alone. Kobe's transformation from cowering ship's boy to confident officer who dares to challenge fleet admiral decisions demonstrates how exposure to authentic leadership can inspire individuals to discover courage they never knew they possessed. The former warlord system's collapse reflects the inevitable failure of arrangements that attempt to legitimize piracy through government sanction, while maintaining the moral authority necessary to justify systematic oppression of civilian populations. These alliances of convenience always contain seeds of their own destruction. For individuals powerful enough to serve as deterrents against other pirates, inevitably developed capabilities that exceeded the world government's ability to control through conventional means. The revolutionaries' growing success in liberating kingdoms across the world demonstrates how resistance movements multiply when populations witness practical alternatives to the systems that have defined their entire existence, how hope spreads like wildfire once people understand that current arrangements are chosen rather than inevitable. Each successful revolution provides example for others, while weakening the world government's claims that their authority represents natural order rather than artificial imposition. The ancient weapons' gradual awakening to their intended purposes reflects cosmic forces working to restore the balance of power that existed before the Void Centuries conflicts tipped global authority toward institutions that treat divine inheritance as threat rather than blessing. Pluton, Poseidon, and Uranus were created to serve liberation rather than oppression, their terrible power designed to protect freedom rather than enforce submission to tyrannical authority. Princess Shirahoshi's growing understanding of her role as Poseidon demonstrates how divine succession operates through individuals who initially lack awareness of their cosmic significance. Gradual revelation that allows character development to occur before power reaches levels that could corrupt those who lack sufficient wisdom to wield such capabilities responsibly. Her gentle nature provides safeguards against the kind of abuse that has characterized most applications of overwhelming force throughout recorded history. The Fishman Islands' integration into Luffy's protection network represents restoration of alliances that supported the Great Kingdom's commitment to defending freedom across all species and environments, recognition that liberation must encompass every form of conscious life, rather than limiting itself to particular racial or cultural groups. The prejudices that have divided surface dwellers from underwater civilizations reflect artificial divisions created to prevent the kind of cooperation that could challenge world government authority. The approaching final war that many observers believe inevitable carries implications that extend far beyond mere military conflict between competing political systems, representing instead the ultimate confrontation between cosmic principles and institutional arrangements that have violated divine heritage for 8 centuries. This will not be resolved through superior tactics or overwhelming force alone, but through alignment with cosmic patterns that operate according to justice rather than expediency. The convergence of inherited divine powers in individuals like Luffy, the awakening of ancient weapons to their true purposes, the global spread of revolutionary consciousness, and the approaching revelation of suppressed historical knowledge creates conditions that make transformation inevitable rather than merely desirable. The world government's desperate attempts to maintain control through increasing applications of force reflect their recognition that current systems cannot survive exposure to truths they have spent centuries suppressing. The new generation of Marines like Kobe and Helmeppo, who have been exposed to authentic leadership, represent hope that military institutions can be reformed rather than simply destroyed, that the legitimate functions of law enforcement and international security can be separated from the oppressive applications that have characterized world government policy. Their moral development suggests that even organizations built upon corrupt foundations can be redeemed when staffed by individuals who understand the difference between serving justice and enabling tyranny. As we contemplate the vast network of connections that link current events to patterns established during the Age of Heaven, we begin to understand that divine withdrawal from direct world governance was never intended as permanent abandonment, but as patient cultivation of conditions that would eventually permit restoration of cosmic principles through mortal agency rather than imposed correction. The gods trusted that worthy inheritors would eventually emerge who possessed both the power and wisdom necessary to guide the world toward harmony between heavenly ideals and earthly realities. The island that exists beyond the reach of conventional navigation, hidden from all log-pose detection through manipulations of space and time that transcend mortal understanding of how reality operates, stands as the ultimate destination toward which all dreams of freedom and discovery inevitably converge. Laughtale represents more than mere geographical location or treasure repository, serving instead as cosmic nexus where divine truth intersects with mortal aspiration in ways that transform everyone who proves worthy of reaching its shores through the accumulation of wisdom, courage, and spiritual purity that the Grand Line's countless challenges are designed to cultivate in those who refuse to surrender their deepest convictions. Goldie, Roger's discovery of whatever ultimate revelation awaits at the world's end was not random fortune or superior navigation, but the inevitable result of cosmic forces recognizing someone whose character had developed to the point where divine knowledge could be entrusted without risk of corruption or misuse. The Pirate King's tears upon witnessing the One Piece speak to recognition of truth so profound that initial comprehension overwhelmed even his considerable emotional reserves, revealing patterns of meaning that connected every moment of his journey to purposes far grander than any individual lifetime could encompass alone. The laughter that echoes across the island's mysterious landscape represents not mere amusement at some cosmic joke, but the sound of consciousness, awakening to understanding that transcends the limitations that normally constrain mortal perception, recognition of how perfectly every seemingly random event throughout history has contributed to the unfolding of divine plans whose scope encompasses not just individual destinies, but the spiritual evolution of entire civilizations across temporal scales that dwarf normal human experience. Roger's decision to surrender himself to execution, rather than reveal the One Piece's true nature, reflects understanding that cosmic truth cannot be imposed upon the world through external authority, but must be discovered through personal journey that develops the wisdom necessary to comprehend revelations that would destroy minds unprepared for their magnitude. His final words ignited the Great Pirate Age, not through random inspiration, but through carefully orchestrated catalyst, designed to generate the conditions necessary for his spiritual successor to emerge when cosmic timing aligned to permit divine intervention. The road poneglyphs that serve as keys to Laughtale's location represent more than navigational tools, functioning instead as spiritual examinations that test whether potential visitors have accumulated sufficient understanding of historical truth, moral principle, and cosmic purpose to warrant access to knowledge that could reshape the world according to divine rather than human will. Each stone tablet requires not just deciphering skills, but spiritual readiness to accept responsibility for whatever ultimate truth their combined information reveals. The scattered placement of these crucial poneglyphs across the most dangerous locations in the New World ensures that collecting them requires confrontation with the kind of challenges that forge character, while eliminating those whose motivations remain rooted in selfish ambition rather than genuine desire to serve principles larger than individual gratification. Big Mom's protection of one tablet, Kaido's possession of another, the world government's desperate attempts to control the third, all reflect recognition that these stones represent power too dangerous to be controlled by any single faction whose agenda might conflict with cosmic purposes. The cooperation required to gather all 4 road poneglyphs forces potential discoverers of the One Piece to demonstrate the kind of collaborative spirit that characterized the Great Kingdom during its golden age of divine mortal partnership ensuring that Laugh Tale's secrets will be revealed only to those who understand that ultimate truth serves collective elevation rather than individual aggrandizement. This requirement filters out aspirants whose approach to discovery remains tainted by the competitive mentality that has corrupted most human institutions since the Age of Heaven's conclusion. The revelation that awaits at Laugh Tale likely encompasses not just historical knowledge about the Void Century or the Great Kingdom's achievements, but comprehensive understanding of how divine succession operates across cosmic time, scale, how mortal beings relate to forces that transcend individual existence, how the transition from the Age of Heaven to the current era was always intended as temporary preparation for something far grander than either purely divine or purely human governance could achieve alone. The ancient weapon's true purpose becomes clear within this context, revealed not as instruments of destruction, but as tools designed to facilitate the kind of global transformation that divine restoration requires. Devices capable of dismantling oppressive systems while preserving the communities that have been forced to exist within them. Pluton, Poseidon, and Uranus represent different aspects of cosmic authority: terrestrial, oceanic, and atmospheric, working together to reshape the world according to principles that honor both divine wisdom and mortal aspiration. The will of D's ultimate significance emerges as more than genetic inheritance or cultural tradition, representing instead the preservation of spiritual DNA necessary for bridging the gap between departed gods and ascending mortals. Bloodlines that carry within their very cellular structure the capacity to channel divine power without being corrupted by its magnitude. Those who bear this mysterious initial serve as living links between the Age of Heaven and whatever golden age might emerge from successful restoration of cosmic principles. Joy Boy's promise to the Fishman Island, preserved in poneglyph form for over 800 years, takes on cosmic dimensions when understood as commitment made not just by individual leader, but by divine forces operating through mortal agency, guarantee that spiritual evolution will eventually overcome the artificial barriers that separate different forms of consciousness based on species, size, or environmental adaptation. This promise encompasses not just political liberation, but spiritual recognition of inherent worth that transcends physical differences. The Noah that rests beneath Fishman Island represents more than massive ship, but ark designed to preserve essential elements of civilization during whatever transformative process divine restoration might require, vessel capable of carrying populations to safety while cosmic forces reshape the world's fundamental systems. Its enormous size reflects understanding that change on divine scales requires preparation for consequences that exceed normal human capacity to comprehend or manage through conventional means. The straw hat that connects Roger to Luffy through Shanks represents physical manifestation of spiritual inheritance, tangible symbol of how divine authority passes between worthy individuals according to cosmic patterns that operate across generations rather than being contained within single lifetimes. This simple woven accessory carries within its fibers the accumulated hopes and dreams of everyone who has ever believed that the world could be transformed through the application of sufficient determination and wisdom. The laughter that gives Laugh Tale its name may reflect cosmic recognition of the supreme irony that mortal beings have spent 8 centuries constructing elaborate systems to avoid accepting responsibilities that divine inheritance makes. Inevitable that all efforts to suppress cosmic truth have only delayed rather than prevented the restoration of principles that govern how conscious beings should relate to one another and to the forces that transcend individual existence. The transformation that discovering the One Piece triggers in those worthy of its revelation likely encompasses not just personal enlightenment, but cosmic authorization to serve as bridge between divine wisdom and mortal implementation, recognition as someone capable of channeling godly power in service to life, rather than wielding it for personal aggrandizement or institutional control. This authorization comes with responsibilities that extend far beyond individual destiny to encompass the spiritual evolution of entire civilizations. The timing of Luffy's approach to Laugh Tale coincides with cosmic conditions that make divine restoration not just possible, but necessary. Alignment of ancient prophecies, awakened powers, and global circumstances that create window of opportunity for transformation that might not reopen for centuries if current chance is missed. The drums of liberation that echo when Gear 5th manifests announce not just individual awakening, but planetary preparation for whatever cosmic shift discovering the One Piece will trigger. The world government's increasing desperation to prevent anyone from reaching Laugh Tale reflects their understanding that exposure of whatever truth awaits there would demolish every justification they have ever offered for their authority. That authentic divine revelation would expose the illegitimacy of systems built upon suppression of human potential and artificial scarcity, designed to maintain hierarchical control over populations capable of creating abundance for all. The Revolutionary Army's unconscious preparation for whatever transformation the One Piece's discovery might trigger demonstrates how cosmic forces work through mortal agents to create conditions necessary for successful divine restoration, ensuring that infrastructure exists for implementing whatever changes divine wisdom might require, while minimizing the chaos that could result from attempting to transform entrenched systems without proper preparation or popular support. The ancient libraries that preserve fragments of Age of Heaven knowledge, the eternal witnesses who carry memories of divine governance, the bloodlines that maintain spiritual inheritance across centuries of persecution, all represent cosmic insurance policies designed to ensure that essential elements of divine wisdom would survive whatever catastrophes might befall the world during its long journey toward readiness for spiritual restoration. The convergence of all these elements as Luffy approaches his ultimate destination suggests that the One Piece represents not treasure to be claimed, but cosmic responsibility to be accepted, role to be embraced, that encompasses not just personal fulfillment, but service to principles larger than any individual lifetime could contain. The laughter that awaits discovery may be recognition of how perfectly every challenge encountered, every alliance forged, every sacrifice made has contributed to preparation for accepting guardianship of divine heritage that transcends the normal boundaries between mortal ambition and cosmic purpose. As we drift deeper into contemplation of what ultimate revelation might await at the world's end, we begin to understand that Laugh Tale represents not final destination but commencement, not conclusion of adventure, but beginning of responsibility that will transform the discoverer into instrument through which divine wisdom can once again guide mortal development toward harmony between heavenly ideals and earthly realities, ensuring that the Age of Heaven's principles survive to illuminate whatever golden age might emerge from the successful integration of cosmic truth with human aspiration. As our journey through forgotten time draws to its close, we find ourselves contemplating the eternal dance between divine and mortal, between memory and oblivion. The Age of Heaven may have ended, but its echoes continue to shape every wave that crashes upon distant shores, every dream that stirs in a pirate's heart. Perhaps the gods never truly disappeared. Perhaps they simply learned to work through those brave enough to carry their will forward. In Luffy's laughter, in the bonds between the Straw Hats, in every act of defiance against tyranny, the divine spark continues to burn. Rest now, knowing that some truths are too powerful to be forgotten forever, and that dawn always follows the darkest night. The Age of Gods may return, not through conquest, but through the simple, profound act of people choosing to believe in something greater than themselves.